Part 7. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 61. Huang Manting is the daughter of Mr. Huang of the Morning Chamber of Commerce. She is an 8th grade Qi practitioner. No one has ever scolded or abused her since she was a child. She showed amazing talent when she was young. She reached the peak of Jing refining at the age of 13 and entered the Qi refining realm at the age of 14. She is very smart and talented. Although her parents are busy, she has not developed a spoiled habit like ordinary rich ladies. However, Huang Manting's problem is actually much more serious than spoiled. Morning Chamber of Commerce. This is located in the most prosperous area of Tianqian City, and a rather luxurious mansion is located here. The hall decorated with exquisite and gorgeous decorations shows the wealth of the owner. Huang Manting, who is called a demon girl, sits with her legs crossed, her hands supporting her fragrant cheeks, and her tender white feet wrapped in a pair of black embroidered shoes are shaking. Beside her, the spy responsible for secretly investigating Musian stood respectfully beside her and confided the intelligence he had obtained in the past 2 days one by one. "Miss, this is the information about Musian that I found out in the past 2 days." Huang Manting narrowed her eyes slightly and said softly, "A few years ago, he was still a useless young master who was obsessed with beauty. He had nothing good except his face. Later, he became more restrained because he fell in love with the eldest daughter of the Bai family, and pursued her madly, but was repeatedly rejected. Then some time ago, the Bai family was hit by a disaster and was suppressed by my father and the head of the Gongsun clan. Bai Ruoxi had to ask for the help of the Mu family. There is no problem here. However, now that the head of the Bai family has returned, and the sect assessment is about to begin, Bai Ruoxi has no reason to follow Musian wholeheartedly. After all, with the strength that Bai Ruoxi showed yesterday, it would be very easy for her to enter the Lianji sect, and she might even be able to compete for the position of an inner disciple. In this case, she has no reason to be so devoted to Musian, unless she likes Musian. But for a long time in the past, Bai Ruoxi hated Musian very much. At that time, Musian was not even Bai Ruoxi's spare tire. Why did Bai Ruoxi's attitude change in just a few days? Could it be that he was threatened? Asked the maid next to him. Huang Manting hooked the embroidered shoes on her toes as if nothing had happened, and said lightly, "Impossible, unless the Bai family is really facing a crisis of extinction, there is no reason for Miss Bai to do this. And, I didn't see that she had any intention of resisting yesterday. Could it be that she just simply likes Musian?" the maid guessed. The embroidered shoes fell to the ground from her toes. Huang Manting twisted her hair with a slender finger and squinted her eyes and said, "If so, it's really interesting. In just a few days, how did Musian capture the heart of the cold and beautiful first woman? And, what would Bai Ruoxi's reaction be if she knew that the man she liked gradually became someone else's shape, or even became a slave under someone else's feet?" Huang Manting tapped the edge of the chair gently. The maid understood what she meant, bent her knees slightly, held Huang Manting's smooth white jade toes, and put on her embroidered shoes. At this time, a servant outside the house hurried into the hall, with a subtle look, and said, "Miss, Master Mu is asking for an audience at the door." He remembered that when Mr. Huang went to the auction house today, he specifically told him that if Musian wanted to see him in the next few days, he should say that he had something to do and had not returned home yet. This statement clearly meant that he did not want to get involved in the affairs between the Mu family and the Gongsun family, or even the Bai family. Mr. Huang is a businessman, and what businessmen care about most is only profit. Huang Manting raised her eyes slightly and said, "Didn't you tell him that my father was not in the Chamber of Commerce today?" "I did, but Master Mu said he came to see you." "Oh." Huang Manting narrowed her eyes slightly and became a little interested. As the largest chamber of commerce in Tianqian City, the Dan Chamber of Commerce naturally has trade relations with many families, and the Mu family is no exception. However, Musian had basically never said a few words to Huang Manting in the past. Although the latter was also a beauty, her personality made Musian dislike her. Musian came to see her today, which naturally made Huang Manting more curious. "Please ask him to come in," Huang Manting said. Not long after, a handsome young man walked into the hall under the guidance of the servants. Huang Manting immediately showed a sweet smile on her face and said, "Master Mu, please sit down." After inviting Musian to sit down, Huang Manting asked the servants to leave the hall, and then personally poured him a cup of tea. "Master Mu, I wonder if you came to visit our Chinexi Chamber of Commerce early in the morning. Is there anything?" Huang Manting asked softly. Musian shook his head and smiled. "Originally, there was nothing, but I recently learned from the spy that Miss Huang was investigating my affairs. It should be said that the Mu family is worthy of being a family. They are really well connected in Tianqian City. They have just investigated Musian for less than half a day, and the news has leaked out." Huang Manting narrowed her eyes slightly, her voice clear and pleasant. "Master Mu, are you here to blame Manting? What she did was at best to satisfy her personal curiosity, and would not threaten the overall interests of the Mu family. Therefore, even if the Mu family knew about it, they would at most give a verbal warning and would not do anything. In other words, even if Musian came to the Chinexi Chamber of Commerce today to ask her for an explanation, he would only be incompetent and furious." "Who knows?" Musian shook his head. "How can I bear to blame a beauty like Miss Huang?" Musian smiled. Huang Manting narrowed her eyes slightly, and was quite pleased with Musian's praise. She stared at Musian suspiciously. "Then what is Master Mu here for?" "I'm here to satisfy Miss Huang's curiosity," Musian said seriously. "Instead of asking someone to investigate for a long time and find nothing, it's better for me to answer Miss Huang's question myself." Huang Manting smiled sweetly. "You came to Chinexi Chamber of Commerce in private just to satisfy my curiosity. If Miss Bai knew about it, would she really not be jealous?" "Why does it sound like a bitch?" Mu Jian picked up the teacup and took a sip of tea, and said with a smile, "She is not the kind of jealous person." Although Musian felt that he didn't understand women very well, he could tell from Bai Ruoxi's character that although the girl looked cold, she was actually a very tolerant person. After all, with such a big heart, it is normal to be able to tolerate others. "I once heard that Master Mu was pursuing Miss Bai, and he often used to be hot-tempered but cold-hearted. Is this true?" Huang Manting suddenly asked. Since Musian said he was here to answer her question, she would naturally not be polite. "It's true." Musian nodded and smiled. "In the past, he did have a warm face but a cold butt. Bai Ruoxi has always been indifferent to Musian's pursuit, and even hated it. It's just that he is the eldest son of the Mu family, so he can't speak too seriously. But if I have to talk about it, Musian has been equally hot and cold in the past 2 days, but this time, Bai Ruoxi was much more enthusiastic towards him, and even a little shy." "That's strange. How did Master Mu pursue Miss Bai in just a few days?" Huang Manting asked curiously. Musian smiled and said, "How I pursued it in the past, I naturally pursue it in the same way recently." As he spoke, he sighed and said, "Ruoxi is actually a relatively simple girl. The reason why she agreed to my pursuit may be because she was moved by my sincerity." Huang Manting smiled lightly. "Congratulations to Master Mu. It's great to be able to pursue such a beautiful lady as Miss Bai." Musian smiled slightly. "I feel very lucky too." Huang Manting changed the topic and continued, "Miss Bai's attack yesterday was amazing. She defeated Gong Sun Cheng with just one sword. I wonder how much Master Mu knows about her bronze sword. This is what she really wants to know. She naturally cares about the relationship between Musian and Bai Ruoxi, but what she cares more about is the devastating power Bai Ruoxi showed yesterday." Musian pondered for a moment and said, "I don't know the details, but in the same realm, she should have no enemies." Huang Manting stared into Musian's eyes and said, Master Mu is so sure. You seem to be at the 8th level of Qi training, right? You should have seen the power displayed by that bronze sword much more clearly than I did, Musian said. Huang Manting was silent. Although she didn't want to admit it, when she saw Bairuoxi's sword on the stage, she did feel a sense of powerlessness in her heart. Even though she kept hinting that she would have a chance to fight back as long as she avoided Bairuoxi's weird sword, but the question is, can that sword really be avoided? It seems that Miss Bai will be able to defeat her peers this time and become the first disciple to enter the Liangyi section, Huang Manting said quietly. Musian smiled and said nothing. He just came to the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce to negotiate and show off to the Gongsun family. The chat with Huang Manting was just to kill time at best, and he could leave after a while. At this time, Huang Manting suddenly changed her voice and said quietly, I may not be Bairuoxi's opponent, but if... She gently placed her slender hand on the back of Musian's hand, raised her eyes slightly, and said in a soft and sweet voice, what if I am Bairuoxi's love rival? How about you stop being Bairuoxi's husband and become my man? When she said this, she gently held Musian's palm with her delicate hands. Musian frowned slightly, feeling a little embarrassed for a moment, but a little moved, and said, Miss Huang, this is inappropriate. I can't be sorry to Ruoxi. The corners of Huang Manting's mouth turned up inadvertently, the hand holding the teacup suddenly shook, and the tea splashed on her chest. She stood up in panic and said softly, no, Mr. Mu, can you wipe it for me? Musian lowered his head and said helplessly, Miss Huang, it really can't be done, Ruoxi will be angry if she finds out. Just wipe it for me. Huang Manting gently grabbed Musian's hand, stuffed a handkerchief into his hand, and guided his palm to wipe the tea for herself. Musian was helpless, but at Huang Manting's request, he still reluctantly wiped it gently. Huang Manting took full notice of Musian's performance, and couldn't help but feel a little contempt in her eyes. Bairuoxi's strength is amazing, but her vision in choosing Taoist companions is really disappointing. With a little trick, he was fascinated. This time, let him wipe the tea on her body. Next time, she should let him lie on the floor and lick her feet. The so-called training should be done step by step. Sorry, I really caused trouble to Master Mu. Huang Manting's eyes were full of apology, and she said softly, you don't blame Manting, do you? Miss Huang, please don't tell Ruoxi about this. She will ignore me if she finds out, Musian said helplessly. If I ignore you, Master Mu can accompany me in the future, right? Huang Manting said softly, by the way, Master Mu, we have an auction in 2 days. I would like to invite Master Mu to the private room. Would you please do me the honor? When she said this, she raised her eyes slightly, with a pair of moist eyes with a request. If Master Mu refuses to agree, I will have to tell Miss Bai about what happened just now. Musian said in embarrassment, but I really can't let Ruoxi down, hey. When she said this, she sighed heavily. Looking at Musian's innocent and handsome face like a boy next door, and the embarrassed look on his face at this time, Huang Manting's mouth corners inadvertently raised a charming arc, and said softly. Just this time, just accompany me this time, okay. As she said this, she gently grabbed one of Musian's hands with both hands, with a little girl's pleading in her eyes. The soft and sweet voice, coupled with the charming face and the pitiful pleading, if someone of a lower level, might really fall into the sweet love net woven by Huang Manting. Musian looked at the pleading in Huang Manting's eyes, fully demonstrating the self-cultivation of an actor, sighed lightly, gently kneaded Huang Manting's slender jade-like soft little hand, and said, okay, but Miss Huang, don't threaten me with this matter next time. Really? Great. Huang Manting patted her chest lightly, and a strand of hair slid down from her forehead, looking particularly charming. Next, Musian chatted with Huang Manting for a few more words, during which his eyes were uncontrollably attracted by her, as if he was fascinated. Then, seeing that it was getting late, he got up and said goodbye. Musian bowed and said, "Miss Huang, let's meet at the auction house in 2 days. I will come to find you then." Huang Manting smiled and nodded, "Well, I am looking forward to it." With the maid's farewell, Musian turned and left the Dan Chamber of Commerce. He gently clenched his palms and recalled the feel of the witch in the Dan Chamber of Commerce just now. Oh, that weight is not even half of Biruoxi's. No wonder she didn't win the title of the most beautiful woman in Tianqian City. First, it's her almost pathological sadistic personality, and second, it's probably, her breast volume is far less than Biruoxi's. Musian got on the carriage and said to the driver, "Let's go to Kaihai Inn. Since we are out, let's buy some Osmanthus cake and then go to visit senior sister Lan. It just so happens that the snow lotus I gave her before is almost withered, so I can give her a new snow lotus." So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 62. Musian took a carriage to Kaihai Inn and bought the famous local Osmanthus cake. Soon he arrived at the inn where Lan Murian was. After getting off the carriage and entering the inn, Musian knocked on the door of the guest room. "Come in," a clear and cold voice came from the room. This crisp and pleasant sound, like ice cubes thrown into a water cup, makes people feel a kind of charm that can calm down the anxious heart. Musian pushed the door open and saw his senior sister, who had been in Tianqian City for a few days but still stayed in the inn and rarely went out. Lan Murian seemed to have just finished meditating and slowly opened her eyes. The moon-white long skirt set off her snow-white skin, revealing a translucent beauty in the dim light. A pair of clear eyes was enough to make people feel inferior at first sight. However, this would not affect Musian, nor would it make him respect him. Even if Lan Murian was a cultivator in the refining god realm and had a noble status, it would not work. He was LSP. Musian put the box in his hand on the table, turned his head and smiled. "I told you in the letter yesterday that I would invite you to taste the Osmanthus cake of Kaihai Inn, so I brought it to you today. By the way, have you read the letter, senior sister?" "No," Lan Murian said lightly. Musian subconsciously glanced at the opened paper crane on the table, pretended not to know, retracted his gaze, and smiled. "This Osmanthus cake tastes great, senior sister can try it?" Lan Murian nodded slightly, and said reservedly, "Put it aside for now. It seems that there is no way to see the beauty of senior sister under the veil." Musian can't help feeling a little regretful. When he came to Yangfeng Inn, he thought that when Lan Murian eats Osmanthus cake, he will naturally take off the veil, and then he will be able to see her beauty. Unfortunately, the other party does not seem to intend to show his true face in front of others. By the way, the snow lotus seems to have withered before. I'll replace it with another one for my senior sister. Musian noticed that the snow lotus in the bottle beside him had withered and died. He took out a snow lotus that exuded a faint and quiet fragrance as if by magic and placed it in the bottle. "It's a pity that there is no Liuguang soil, otherwise this flower can be preserved for a few more months," Musian sighed with some regret. Lan Murian looked at the snow lotus in the vase, and for the first time there was a trace of doubt in his eyes, and said, "Did you give me that snow lotus last time? Why did he sound like he gave me that snow lotus before? If I remember correctly, wasn't the waiter of Yangfeng Inn put that snow lotus here as a decoration a few days ago? How did he give it to me?" Musian turned his head to look at his senior sister, who was sitting upright, and smiled. "This snow lotus is only cultivated in such a small pond in the Mu Mansion. In Tianqian City, I am afraid that only the Mu family has it. The snow lotus on the paper crane last time was given to my senior sister by me." As he said this, he seemed to recall something and continued, "Oh, I heard a few days ago that the owner of Yangfeng Inn seemed to be cultivating some snow lotus artificially, but it is not as good as the snow lotus in the Mu Mansion after all. At least in terms of fragrance, the snow lotus in the Mu Mansion is better." Lan Murian's eyes moved slightly, and he stood up and walked to the table. Looking at the snow lotus standing quietly in the bottle, which looked pure white, he lowered his head and sniffed it. The faint fragrance with a little mint floated into the nose, and there was a feeling that the sluggish state was suddenly refreshed. It is different from the snow lotus placed in the inn last time, the fragrance and even the quality of the snow lotus are better. Then the question is, Musian said that he sent a snow lotus with a paper crane last time. So where is the snow lotus now? Lan Murian's eyes flickered slightly, as if she thought of something, and her eyes slowly widened a little. Last time she had not changed the position of the paper crane, in other words, the paper crane flew to the back mountain of Lianji sect. Did the snow lotus finally fall into the hands of the master? Given the master's personality, what would happen if he received the snow lotus? For some reason, the delicate face of the cold beauty under the veil inexplicably had a faint smile. Musian couldn't help but look at Lan Murian twice more. Her skin was as white as cream, her eyebrows and eyes were smiling, and her beautiful face could be vaguely seen under the veil. Her temperament was clear and cold, and a bit mysterious. At this moment, Musian had the urge to take off the veil on her face. But considering that this was a very favorable thing, he still held back. At this time, Musian suddenly found a thin booklet on the table. The booklet was open and had several names written on it. Musian was very familiar with these names: Bai Ruoxi, Gongsun Cheng, Huang Manting, Ye Yu, and even Ye Lingxian, etc. Behind these names, there were written the life experiences of these people. Although not detailed, the basic content was true. Among these names, 3 names were circled: one was Bai Ruoxi, one was Huang Manting, and the other was Ye Lingxian. Is this the candidate that the senior sister is more optimistic about in the sect assessment? Musian thought secretly. Not to mention Bai Ruoxi, since the fusion of the bronze piece, his strength has skyrocketed, and with the increase of the heavenly Dao Qi, he is now invincible among his peers. Huang Manting has always been regarded as the second person besides Gongsun Cheng in the past, and she is also the best among her peers. Ye Lingxian, this girl is a bit surprising. Apart from being a little pretty, there is nothing outstanding about her. Her personality does seem a bit like that of a young lady. She should not just be an heir of the Ye family. And Ye Yu's name was not circled. Could it be that the chosen one is useless to Lan Murian? After taking a look, Musian saw his own name under the dense text. The introduction introduced his life experience, and at the end added a sentence: slippery tongue, a little pervert, be careful. Musian raised his eyebrows slightly, unhappy. He raised his head and asked calmly, "Senior sister, where did you get this booklet?" Such a detailed introduction does not seem to be investigated in just a few days. Lan Murian glanced at him slightly and said lightly, "I have my own way." From the tone, she didn't intend to elaborate. Musian changed the question and asked curiously, "This circled name represents the candidate you are more optimistic about this time, right? Didn't Ye Lingxian just reach the Qi training stage? Could it be that she has a good talent?" Lan Murian looked at Musian deeply and said, "Don't offend her." "Do you know her?" Musian asked. Lan Murian shook her head, "I don't know her, but the elders have specifically told me that Ye Lingxian must be one of the candidates for joining the sect this time." Musian took a look at the introduction of Ye Lingxian in the booklet. She looked no different from an ordinary person. She grew up in the Ye family and condensed the cauldron before the age of 15 to enter the Qi refining realm. Apart from that, there was nothing special about her. Musian pondered for a moment and said, "The person who wrote this booklet has hidden agenda. You can't trust him completely." Lan Murian looked at him sideways, and there seemed to be a hint of displeasure in her eyes, which were always calm. Musian frowned and continued, "How can I be as bad as the booklet says? What do you mean by being obsessed with beauty when you were young, and knowing how to suppress your desires a little when you grow up, but you are still a little pervert in essence? What is this about? Complete slander. Unexpectedly, Lan Murian glanced at Musian coldly and said, "Go out if you have nothing to do." Why was she angry? Musian said, "Sister, I will take you to Tianqian City in a few days. I promised to take you out to play in the previous letter, but you stayed in the inn all the time. This is not okay." Lan Murian shook her head gently, "I can't leave casually, it will cause unnecessary commotion. Now all the cultivators in Tianqian City know that Lan Murian has come to Tianqian City. It was okay when there were not many people at the competition arena last time. If she went to a place with more people, she would inevitably be pointed at. She doesn't like too many eyes focusing on her." Musian heard this and glanced at Lan Murian's obviously unhappy look again. She had to nod and smiled, "In this case, wait for the next opportunity to take you around." After that, Musian left the guest room. As soon as he entered the carriage, he noticed a tall beauty in a red cheongsam from the corner of his eye. It's not the slender figure of a young girl, but it's as plump and attractive as a peach, which makes people's eyes involuntarily attracted to her. Strange, why does Sister Feiying come to Yangfeng Inn so frequently these 2 days? Musian looked at Feiying's back as she walked into the inn, and only said to himself in his heart until her back disappeared from his sight. He shook his head gently, no longer thinking about it, got into the carriage, and leaned leisurely on the soft couch. The afternoon sun shone through the curtains. Musian narrowed his eyes slightly in the breeze, which was very leisurely. Now everything has been handled. What he needs to do next is to wait for the start of the sect assessment with peace of mind, and then go directly through the back door to Lianji sect. As for other things, they are just appetizers before the sect assessment. The carriage passed Kai Inn unknowingly, and he opened his eyes slightly, and the corner of his eye just fell on a girl standing at the door of the inn. That pure and sweet face, like first love, was particularly bright and charming under the eyes. Her figure was slender and graceful, and the thin belt around her waist outlined her willow waist. Her long hair fluttered in the wind, giving her a kind of classical beauty. It was Yechian. "Stop for a moment." Musian signaled the driver to stop, and then he opened the curtain and got off the carriage. Not far away, Yechian, wearing a light blue double-breasted dress, stood at the door of the inn, looking like she was in a daze. At this moment, she suddenly felt a shadow quietly covering her. She raised her head slightly. When she saw the boy clearly, she was immediately surprised and said, "Master Mu, why are you here? I just happened to pass by here when I was taking a walk, and I saw you." Thinking about it carefully, this may also be a kind of fate. Musian glanced at the bustling crowd in Kai Inn and smiled, "Miss Jian'er, what are you doing here in such a hot day? Are you eating alone?" Yechian looked up at Musian, and after a while, she nodded gently, "This morning, Sister Lingxian and I said that the Osman Thus cake here is delicious, but she didn't believe it, so I wanted to bring one over for her to try, but..." She took a look at the flow of people inside and couldn't help sighing. This Kai Inn has always had good business, and the Osman Thus cake here is basically not available if you don't make an appointment in advance. Yechian obviously didn't know about this kind of thing, because in the past, the servants of the Ye mansion went to buy it. This was her first time coming here by herself. Musian thought for a moment and said with a smile, "Wait for me here." Under Yechian's puzzled gaze, Musian walked into the Kai Inn. Not long after, Yechian saw him walk out of the inn with a box of Osman Thus cake and handed it to her. Yechian blinked, subconsciously glanced at Musian, and said, "Master Mu, why can you buy Osman Thus cake?" She had just asked the waiter, and the other party answered her that it was sold out today. As a result, Musian went to the inn for less than an incense stick of time, and he bought it. Musian showed a mysterious smile and said, "I have my own way." Musian can buy Osman Thus cake directly because he is Musian, and the Mu family is behind him. Even if the Osman Thus cake is booked out, this inn will find a way to prepare another one for Musian. But other people don't have such special treatment. Ye Qian hesitated and politely refused, sorry, I can't accept your things. Miss Qian, this osmanthus cake is not a valuable item. I just want to invite you and Miss Lingxian to enjoy it. Don't worry so much, Musian smiled. Seeing that Ye Qian still had a hint of hesitation on her face, Musian asked, did someone tell you something? It stands to reason that the Qi training pill yesterday should have been enough to make Ye Qian let down her guard against him, but she was so hesitant today. I think something must have happened after she went back. Ye Qian hesitated for a moment and whispered, Sister Lingxian and Brother Ye both told me not to get close to you. It's okay for Ye, but I didn't expect Ye Lingxian to remind her sister after she went back. Musian sighed, Sister Qian, do you think I look like a bad person? Ye Qian raised her head slightly and peeked at the boy in front of her, and the kind and gentle smile on his face, like a neighbor's brother. No. Isn't that enough? Your brother Ye and I do have some conflicts, but it has nothing to do with you, Musian smiled. Ye Qian's originally frowned brows gradually relaxed, holding the small wooden box containing osmanthus cake in both hands, nodded shyly, and said softly. In the sunshine, a faint smile appeared on that pure and lovely face. Although mature and charming ladies are great, this kind of weak girl who can cry for a long time after being punched seems to be pretty good, Musian thought to himself. Sister Qian, you can come to my house when you are free next time. I will treat you to the sweet-scented osmanthus cake made in our house. The little girl looked up at him. When Musian looked at her, her beautiful almond eyes flickered shyly, as if covered with a layer of mist. She lowered her eyes slightly and nodded like a chicken pecking at her head. The vigilance in her heart had been relaxed. It's hot, I'll let the driver take you back, Musian continued. Ye Qian opened her mouth slightly, looked at Musian in surprise, and said quickly, no, wouldn't Brother Mu have to walk back by himself? Just take it as a walk, it's okay here, Musian smiled. The beautiful 15-year-old sister lowered her eyes slightly, hiding the shyness and joy in her eyes, and said in a clear and sweet voice, then I'll trouble you. This feeling of being taken care of meticulously really made her very happy. Ye mansion. Ye slowly opened his eyes, feeling the mixed spiritual energy in his body filling his whole body, and the cauldron in his body had begun to take shape. The bottleneck of the peak of refining essence. Next, as long as I refine the Qi training pill today, I'm afraid I can break through the refining essence realm within 2 days. Such results made Ye quite satisfied. I never thought that after losing the Qi of heaven, I have a stronger talent for cultivation than before. Although this road is more difficult, as long as I can become stronger, it is worth it. Wait until the day of the sect assessment, defeat Musian squarely, and get rid of a worry in my heart, and then I can start my own adventure outside. Ye thought of this and felt very happy. After opening the room, he felt that the unchanging scenery had become extremely beautiful. The clan members were fighting in the yard. Ye looked around and soon fell on the pavilion not far away. In the pavilion, a girl in a lavender skirt sat on a stone chair, revealing a small part of her snow-white calves, and seemed to be resting. Ye Lingxian. Lingxuan's appearance is probably not inferior to Bairuoxi. Thinking about it carefully, it seems that I haven't chatted with her for a long time since I lost my talent. Ye thought of this and was about to step forward and say hello. At this time, his eyes suddenly fell on the snow lotus in Ye Lingxuan's hand. Ye's body stiffened slightly, and his eyes stared at the snow lotus. In Tianqian City, the only place where snow lotus is artificially cultivated is Mu Mansion. Although Yang Fengyin also cultivates snow lotus, it is ultimately a form without soul. Yesterday, I heard from the tribe that Ye Lingxian went to the Mu Mansion, and this snow lotus, I'm afraid it was taken from the Mu Mansion. Ye's eyes were a little colder, and he turned and left the yard. Just when he arrived at the gate of the yard, he saw a carriage parked in front of the mansion. Mu's carriage. Yu stared at the carriage, and the innocent girl who opened the curtain and walked down from the carriage. Qian raised her head slightly, holding a box of Osmanthus cake. When she raised her head and saw Yu with an ugly face, she hesitated, forced a smile, and said, "Brother Yu, do you want to eat Osmanthus cake?" "No." Yu replied coldly, staring at the carriage of the Mu mansion, and said in a deep voice, "Did you just go to the Mu mansion?" The tone did not sound like a brother's concern for his sister, but more like questioning. Qian obviously noticed Yu's abnormality, and couldn't help but look at his cousin twice, then shook his head gently. "I happened to meet Brother Mu when I went to Kai Inn to buy Osmanthus cake. He asked the driver to take me back. Don't get close to him in the future. That person definitely has no good intentions," Yu said lightly. Qian lowered her head, and her originally cheerful mood suddenly became much heavier. "Oh." She lowered her head and walked into the mansion silently holding the Osmanthus cake. Recalling the cold look of Yu when she saw him at the door just now, Qian held the box of Osmanthus cake in her arms, feeling very aggrieved. Originally, she was in a good mood, but she was scolded by her cousin as soon as she arrived at the mansion. No one would be in a good mood. Qian walked into the courtyard of the mansion wearing deerskin short boots. It was not until she saw the beautiful girl in purple dress in front of the pavilion that her eyes gradually regained some brilliance. She took small steps forward and took the initiative to call out, "Sister Lingxian." She wanted to share everything that happened today with her sister. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 63. In the afternoon, Gongsun Cheng stood in a certain room, staring at his father lying on the bedside, his face looking extremely gloomy. Not long ago, his father, who was seriously injured, called him into the room and gave him a severe scolding. The general idea was that he should not attack Musian in the arena. Gongsun Cheng was naturally dissatisfied at first. Although he had planned to attack Musian at that time, didn't he just let it go? Just because of this trivial matter, he was scolded so badly that Gongsun Cheng was naturally extremely dissatisfied. However, not long after, another news came from his subordinates. The 3 villages of the Gongsun family were undergoing handover procedures and transferred to the Mu family. And the reason for this was that Musian was mentally frightened and needed compensation? Dad, do you really believe the nonsense that Musian was mentally frightened? Gongsun Cheng felt that there was nowhere to release his anger, and he stared at his father with dissatisfaction in his eyes. Gongsun Xiong's face was also not very good looking. Looking at the 4th child who failed to achieve anything but failed more than failed, he said coldly, "Are you really an old and stupid father? Because Musian was frightened, you gave up to 3 cities." He naturally knew that this had nothing to do with the 4th child directly. After all, even if there was no Gongsun Cheng incident, Musian would find other ways to take the opportunity to cause trouble. Then why Gongsun Cheng hesitated? Gongsun Xiong sighed heavily. Today during the day, Musian went to the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce. This was the reason why he finally agreed to give up the 3 cities to the Mu family. But didn't my subordinates just report that Mr. Huang was not in the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce today? Musian might just be pretending to be powerful. Gongsun Chendao. It's no longer important whether Musian and Mr. Huang are close. What's important is that the girl from the Huang family also met Musian, Gongsun Xiangan said. You should also know the character of that girl from the Huang family. Gongsun Cheng was speechless. He did know a little bit about Huang Manting's character. The eldest daughter of the Huang family is called a witch because she is not just rebellious. She is a woman with extremely sadistic tendencies, and what she hates most is people like Musian who are addicted to beauty. Whether it is Mr. Huang or Huang Manting meeting Musian, this is a very dangerous signal. Musian and Bairuoxi are very close, and today they seem to have some ambiguity with the girl of the Huang family. Regardless of whether it is a fake or a fake, the Gongsun family cannot take risks in this serious situation. In Sanzuofang City, if you give it, you will give it. Whether it's the group of idiots from the Gongsun family who covet the position of patriarch, or that idiot Musian, I'm afraid they still don't understand the true value of Tongmei pill. Once one enters the Return to Void realm, it will be easy for the Mu family to acquire other neighboring cities. The reason why people in the Return to Void realm can be called land gods is not an exaggeration. It's just that, he must endure it now until his injury heals. When the injury is healed and Tongmei pills are taken, that's when the Gongsun family will really fight back. That evening, Dawn Chamber of Commerce. Huang Manting leaned lazily on the tea chair, playing with the teacup in her hand with her delicate white jade hands, with a charming smile on her face. It seems that although Bairuoxi has great strength, her vision is a bit poor. Recalling how Musian looked like an innocent little virgin in front of her just now, Huang Manting felt a sense of joy in her heart. She was already looking forward to the day when Bairuoxi walked into the hall of Chenexai Chamber of Commerce and saw Musian kneeling next to her and licking her feet, what the other party's reaction would be. It doesn't matter that she is invincible among her peers, but the man she is looking for is just a dog for her, begging for mercy and becoming a slave at her feet. At this time, the attendant's voice suddenly came from outside, "Miss." Huang Manting raised her eyes slightly and said calmly, "Tell me what you want." There was some movement just now on the Gongsun family's territory. It seems that the three Gongsun family's markets are being transferred to the Mu family's name. Huang Manting paused while playing with the teacup in her hand. After a while, her perfectly curved white toes lifted up her embroidered shoes as if nothing had happened. She looked at the attendant, her smile still calm. Gongsun Xiong is injured. With his desire for power, he will naturally not delegate power, but even so, the Gongsun family should not agree to transfer 3 entire cities to the Mu family. Are you sure the information is accurate? The attendant hesitated for a moment and nodded. That's a bit strange. Even if the Mu family and the Bai family join forces, the Gongsun family can always find my father to join forces to fight against the enemy. Why dash? The smile on Huang Manting's face suddenly solidified. At this moment, her mind was like countless videos flashing through her mind. She recalled how Musian was chatting and laughing with her today, how embarrassed he was like an innocent little virgin when she was molested, and how Musian was so shy at that time. Look at her eyes with obsession. After a long time, she slowly exhaled, her face turned extremely ugly, and she came to the conclusion, I was tricked. I came here today to satisfy your curiosity, this is a lie. Musian's purpose from the beginning was just to stay at the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce and chat with her, creating the illusion that he and the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce were close. What Musian is interested in is not her, but the 3 markets of the Gongsun family. I'm actually not as good as Sanzuo Fangji. Huang Manting's face was extremely ugly. Recalling Musian's gentle attitude towards Bairuoxi during the day, and his embarrassed look when facing her, he was probably laughing at her in his heart at that time. Musian. Huang Manting's eyes were filled with anger, and the teacup in her hand had a crack unconsciously, and the tea dripped slowly along her knees to her toes. The maid beside her half crouched beside her, slightly leaning forward. Huang Manting glanced at her coldly, and said, "Just help me clean it." The maid's eyes inevitably had some regrets, but she still bowed her head slightly and said yes, then took out a handkerchief, held Huang Manting's toes and wiped them for her. Huang Manting's fingertips gently tapped the edge of the chair, and those who were familiar with her would know that the eldest lady of the Huang family was already in a state of rage at this time. "Miss, is there anything else I need to do?" the servant beside her asked cautiously. "I will write a letter later." Please help me deliver it to the Mu mansion. By the way, tell Musian that he must not be absent from the auction in 2 days. I will wait for him in the private room. Huang Manting's beautiful eyes were deep and cold. Because of her past impression of Musian, in her eyes, Musian was just a dandy who was obsessed with beauty, but it seems that she did underestimate Musian. Although she lost this time, but next time, it may not be the case. Walking leisurely along the way, Musian finally returned to the Mu mansion. When he came to the yard, he saw a tall and cold beauty. She was wearing a luxurious white dress, which outlined her graceful and protruding figure, revealing a little white on her chest. She sat sideways on a chair and was chatting with Wei Mengru. She seemed to have noticed something, raised her head slightly, and when she saw Musian, a charming smile appeared on her face. This is really strange, Sister Mengro actually chats with others. Musian also smiled at Bairuoxi and walked towards the two of them. What are you talking about? You look so happy, Musian asked with a smile. About the snow lotus you gave me. Bairuoxi's beautiful face showed a faint smile, paused, and continued, Mr. Mu, there will be an auction at the Genexai Chamber of Commerce in 2 days. Can we go together then? Musian was slightly startled and asked in confusion, why are you going to the auction? I heard from Miss Mengro that there will be a batch of Liuguang soil at the Genexai auction in 2 days, so I want to buy some, so that I can temporarily keep the snow lotus you gave me. But I had already promised someone that day. Musian was thinking about how to refuse tactfully. Seeing that Musian didn't speak, Bairuoxi was silent for a moment, and her cold face made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. She raised her head slightly and asked, or is it inconvenient for Master Mu? Or do you have an appointment that day? I don't know if it's my illusion, but Musian always feels that when Bairuoxi looked up at me, her gentle eyes seemed to be much deeper. Why do I feel that I still don't know Bairuoxi well enough? Musian looked at the weak and cold beauty and her dark eyes, and suddenly this thought came to his mind. At this time, a servant suddenly walked in from outside the yard. Musian glanced at him and said, what's the matter? Master, just now a servant from the Morning Sun Chamber of Commerce came to the Mu mansion and asked me to pass on a letter from Miss Huang to you. After saying that, under the gazes of the two, he respectfully handed the letter to Musian. Warm ti. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 64. A letter from Miss Huang. Musian frowned slightly and looked at the attendant standing in front of him. This little brother is not very sensible. Is this a place where we can talk? Just handing me a letter written by someone else so openly. By the way, Miss Wang's attendant asked me to bring a message. The silly attendant seemed to be unaware of anything and spoke again. Please don't miss the auction in 2 days. I will wait for him in the private room. These are Miss Wang's original words. The yard suddenly became strangely quiet. A gust of evening breeze blew, and ripples appeared on the water surface in the yard. Snow lotuses swayed gently in the pool, showing their charming figure, and seemed to be mocking someone. Are you really not sent by the Gongsun family to murder this young master? You have narrowed the road, Musian said in a deep voice. I know, go down. After the servants left the yard, Musian turned his head and looked at the two of them. Bairuoxi looked disappointed and whispered, it seems that you had a good chat with Miss Huang today. This makes people feel like saying, you have a good relationship with the mistress you found outside. Musian said helplessly, today, I went to the Dan Chamber of Commerce purely for the 3 markets of the Gongsun family. As for chatting with Huang Manting, it was just to kill time. I can't just sit there in a daze and say nothing, right? Bairuoxi had a blank expression. What about going to the auction with her in 2 days? You chatted with Huang Manting for the 3 markets of the Gongsun family, so what was the auction in 2 days for? Seeing this, Musian wanted to hold Bairuoxi's little hand first, but she immediately retracted her hand and didn't give Musian a chance. It is obvious that Miss Bai is unhappy now. Musian looked at Wei Mengru again. Sensing Musian's gaze, Wei Mengru was too lazy to even speak. She just glanced at Musian with a look of contempt, and turned around and quietly disappeared in the yard. Sister Mengru's eyes looked quite exciting. Musian silently looked at Wei Mengru's leaving figure, thinking to himself. Fortunately, Wei Mengru was not the kind of jealous person. Although she was usually quiet and a little autistic, in general, the maid was still a very considerate and mature woman. She would leave now just to give Musian and Bairuoxi a space to be alone. If only Bairuoxi was here, it would be much easier to deal with. Bairuoxi's personality, this woman, seemed cold on the outside, but in fact, she was very soft on the inside. This was actually not difficult to see from her heart. As long as she was given a reasonable explanation, she would not be angry. Sensing that Bairuoxi's eyes were fixed on him, Musian took out the letter written by Huang Manting from his arms and handed it to Bairuoxi. Bairuoxi tilted her head slightly, obviously confused, and said, "What does this mean?" Musian sighed softly and said, "Ruoxi, I know that you have been feeling insecure recently because of the changes in your family. I have indeed ignored your feelings. If you don't believe me, let's open the letter together and see what Miss Huang wrote." Bairuoxi was obviously a little surprised. She raised her head and looked at Musian in surprise, saying, "Is it okay for me to read the contents of the letter together?" Musian gently held Bairuoxi's soft little hand and said seriously, "As long as it can make you feel at ease, everything is worth it." This time Bairuoxi did not break free, but just lowered her eyes shyly. At the same time, Musian opened the letter, and as the words jumped onto the paper, Bairuoxi's eyes also curiously fell on the contents of the letter. Mr. Mu. To be honest, before writing this letter, I had an urge to visit you directly at the Mu mansion, but now I am a little calmer. I have to admit that I underestimated you. Miss Bai's vision is not bad. Although you are only at the 3rd level of Qi training, your brain is quite useful. You visited the Dan Chamber of Commerce specially to show the people of the Gongsun family. You took away 3 market towns, but you took all the benefits. But please rest assured that I have no intention of blaming Mr. Mu. On the contrary, I now appreciate Mr. Mu's actions more and more. After all, you are the first person to make Manting suffer. Manting will wait for you in the private room of the Dan auction house the day after tomorrow afternoon. I hope Mr. Mu will do me a favor. Even from the perspective of an observer, it is not difficult to see the gnashing of teeth in the letter. If you put yourself in his shoes, a playboy who is usually unlearned and unskilled visits you, and you treat him as a fool and tease him, but in the end you find that the fool is actually me. Just thinking about it makes people's blood pressure rise suddenly. If Musian wrote another letter to reply Huang Manting at this moment, it would be a real murder. Bairuoxi looked at the contents of the letter, and then slightly turned his head to look at Musian, and said in a soft and pleasant voice, "Did you lie to her?" For some reason, the eyes that were originally a little dark seemed to have regained some light, and even a little excited. Musian shook his head and smiled, "I was just chatting with her, and I didn't lie to her about anything from beginning to end." That's right, he just went to the Dan Chamber of Commerce to chat with Miss Huang and satisfy her curiosity, that's all. Although that's true, but I really feel sorry for her. Bairuoxi sighed softly. If a person as arrogant as Huang Manting finds out that she is being fooled around, I'm afraid she will be so angry that she can't sleep. Musian turned his head and looked at Bairuoxi's almost perfect seductive profile, and smiled, "Since you sympathize with her, why are you still snickering?" Bairuoxi frowned slightly and said, "I'm not laughing." After finishing speaking, he bit his lower lip gently, his face serious, as if he was trying hard to maintain his cold image. However, recalling the content of the letter just now and Huang Manting's incompetent and furious appearance in the morning Chamber of Commerce, Bairuoxi's brows relaxed involuntarily, and she felt particularly happy. Musian was also in a good mood and gently hugged Bairuoxi's waist. The most beautiful woman in Tianqian City felt ashamed in her heart, but she did not break away. This situation was in sharp contrast to the aloofness she used to face Musian in the past. And a crisis was resolved so easily. By the way, are you going to accompany her the day after tomorrow? Bairuoxi suddenly asked. Musian nodded and smiled. If there's nothing else, it doesn't hurt to go there. I'm also curious about what other tricks Miss Huang wants to do. Bairuoxi was not happy and whispered, I also want to go to the auction. Glazed earth was not rare, but it was difficult to find near Tianqian City. In order to preserve the snow lotus, she had to take a small handful of glazed earth no matter what. The underlying meaning of these words was that she hoped that Musian could accompany her, and Musian naturally understood. After thinking for a moment, he nodded and smiled, okay, I will accompany you then. As for Huang Manting, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I can go see her and leave when the time comes. If you choose between Huang Manting and Bairuoxi, this is not a difficult multiple-choice question. After all, the latter's popularity has completely crushed Huang Manting, and Musian currently has no thoughts about Huang Manting. Feeling the warmth in the boy's arms, Bairuoxi's heart felt hot. She raised her eyes slightly and glanced at him. Then she moved her body so that her shoulders were close to Musian's. She leaned her head on his shoulder and made a smile at the corner of her mouth. A shallow arc. Yang Feng in. Lan Feiying sat on the bed and looked at her sister who was sitting at the desk writing a letter. It was mid-autumn, and Lan Mulian was wearing a moon-white splendid dress, with a graceful curve on her back, and a ribbon outlining her slender waist. She had a cool and cold temperament. Although her appearance was extremely beautiful, most people would only think of her when they saw her. He felt inferior and dared not look up at her. Sister, are you writing a letter to the eldest young master of the Mu family? Lan Feiying suddenly asked. Lan Mulian's movement of writing the letter paused slightly. After a while, he said lightly yes and said, he wrote a letter, and the reply is just out of politeness. Oh. Feiying answered her sister in a subtle tone. As Lan Mulian, she didn't believe that no one had written to her sister before, and she didn't see her sister replying to anyone. Of course, as long as you know this kind of thing in your heart, Lan Feiying sees through it and doesn't say it out loud. Her eyes casually fell on the unboxed Osman Thus cake on the table. She narrowed her eyes slightly and said with a smile, this Osman Thus cake was also given to you by the eldest young master of the Mu family, right? Well, you can try it if you like it. He said it is a famous pastry in Tianqian City. Lan Mulian did not deny it. It is indeed quite famous. The sweet-scented Osman Thus cake here tastes great. I occasionally go to Kaihai to taste it in my spare time. As Feiying spoke, her eyes casually fell on the snow-white lotus in a vase on the table. He also gave these flowers. Tisk tisk, it seems that guy really likes his sister. But then again, my sister is already 23 years old this year, how much older than him, right? I didn't remember. If I'm wrong, it seems that the eldest young master of the Mu family has only just graduated this year. She paused deliberately, and when she noticed her sister's eyes glancing over inadvertently, she curved her lips and continued, but age is not important to monks, as long as they love each other, it is enough. Lan Mulian glanced at her charming and affectionate sister coldly and said, he and I don't have that kind of relationship. After saying that, he ignored his sister. Lan Feiying smiled sweetly, sat lazily on the chair, held her chin up, poured herself a cup of tea, and then took out a piece of sweet-scented Osman Thus cake for evening snack. Her eyes fell casually on the snow lotus beside her, and she suddenly said, speaking of which, our auction house has recently purchased a new batch of glazed soil. If my sister is interested, you can go and take a look at it then. Glazed earth is not a particularly rare thing, and Lan Fading also knows that it is not difficult to get a batch of glazed earth as her sister. But now Lan Mulian is still in Tianqian City. By the time Lan Mulian goes back, the snow lotus given by Musian will probably have withered long ago. But I have to host the auction then, so I don't have time to take you there. If you don't know the way, maybe you can consider inviting him to take you there. Lan Fading continued with a smile, at that time, I can arrange a separate private room for you where no one will disturb you. This way, sister will not have to worry about being uncomfortable with too many eyes focused on you. Under the flickering candlelight, Lan Mulian's beautiful eyes flickered slightly, causing ripples in Gu Jing's Weibo mood. Lan Fading's proposal is indeed a bit heartwarming. If she were in Lianji sect now, there would be plenty of ways to preserve the snow lotus forever, but the problem is that she is now in Tianqian City. If she wants to extend the shelf life of the snow lotus, only Liu Guang's oil can do it. And it is a bit unreasonable to stay in the inn every day when she rarely goes down the mountain early. Looking at the folded paper crane, Lan Murian pondered for a long time, then spread it out again and wrote down an invitation to Musian. At the same time, in Ye Mansion. Under the hazy moonlight, Ye Qian, who had been meditating for a whole day, was holding Ye Lingxuan's arm, with her cute face close to her shoulders. Sister, how about we go to Kaihai Inn together next time? The Osman thus cake there tastes really good, Ye Qian suddenly said. Ye Lingxian glanced at the pure and lovely girl and said, is it because the Osman thus cake tastes good, or because it is the Osman thus cake sent by the eldest young master of the Mu family, so it tastes good? What are you talking about, sister? Ye Qian gently pushed Ye Lingxuan's arm, seeming unhappy. Ye Lingxian looked at her sister with a smile, and saw that her seemingly unhappy little face seemed a little shy, so she couldn't help but sigh in her heart. This sister who grew up with her was really too naive. She was actually bought by Musian with a chi training pill and a snack. If she wasn't there, she might have been kidnapped by him in a few days. By the way, sister, there will be an auction in a few days. Why don't we go and have a look? Ye Qian suddenly asked. I heard from the tribe that there will be a batch of Liu Guang soil that can preserve flowers for a long time on the auction. You brought back such a beautiful snow lotus from the Mu mansion. It would be a pity if it withered like this. Ye Lingxian pondered for a moment and nodded gently. She originally planned to invite her sister to go together, but she didn't expect Ye Qian to speak first. But sister, do you know the rules of the auction? Ye Qian asked. In her impression, Ye Lingxian seemed to have never been to any auction. Every time she wanted something, there would always be a mysterious person to bring it to her. Therefore, Ye Lingxian never lacked anything, and naturally there was no need to go to the auction. Ye Lingxian shook her head slightly, I don't know. She paused, and suddenly said, let brother Ye you take us. Ye Qian frowned slightly and whispered, sister decides. Although she said so, she didn't seem very happy. Ye Lingxian saw her sister's reaction clearly. She changed her tone and said, the eldest young master of the Mu family has nothing to do every day, or I will write a letter to invite him later. Ye Qian raised her head slightly and looked at her sister, her eyes shining, and said, won't this cause trouble for him? Ye Lingxian was speechless for a moment, and silently glanced at the pure and innocent girl. Although she always felt that Musian had ill intentions, seeing Ye Qian's completely different reactions when she mentioned Ye Yu and Musian, it was not easy to say bad things about him at the moment. I'll have my servants deliver a letter to him later, Ye Lingxian sighed. Well, Musian is a smart man. He has already been intimidated a little bit before, so he should know how to restrain himself. Moreover, this snow lotus is extremely rare in Tianqian City, so it's worthwhile to spend some time to cultivate it. At night, Musian had just finished his meditation and practice, and contributed his own efforts to Bairuoxi's cultivation. He sat in the moonlight in the backyard without any desires, holding his head with his hands against the stone pillar behind him, holding a paper crane he had just received in his hand, and seemed to be struggling with something. At this time, a slight sound of footsteps suddenly came from beside him. The servant who delivered the letter during the day walked to his side. "Why are you here again?" Musian frowned slightly. The servant hesitated for a moment, then respectfully handed over a letter, saying, "The servant of the Ye mansion just sent a letter, saying that it was a letter from Miss Ye Lingxian of the Ye family." Musian was startled, took the letter, and after asking the servant to leave, he opened the letter and took a look. After a long silence, he silently opened the paper crane he had just received. Then, he spread out 3 letters at the same time. The first one was Huang Manting's invitation letter, and the second one was Lan Murian's paper crane letter today, which finally invited him to attend the auction of the Dan Chamber of Commerce the day after tomorrow. The third one was written by Ye Lingxian, also inviting him to attend the auction. Looking at the 3 invitations in front of him, thinking back to Bairuoxi's invitation tonight, Musian couldn't help but fall into a long contemplation. "It's bad, I won't really fall over, right?" So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 65. This is a bit difficult to deal with. Musian leaned against the courtyard in the middle of the night, looking at the 3 letters in his hand, and fell into a brief contemplation. First of all, Bairuoxi's invitation must not be rejected again. Although the girl has a heart of the world, it is obviously a foolish thing to challenge her patience again and again. As for Ye Lingxian, judging from the girl's vigilance towards herself at that time, this letter was either written by Ye Qian, or Ye Qian asked Ye Lingxian to write it for her. If Ye Qian were put in modern times, she would be the kind of naive schoolgirl who had just entered school and was fascinated by the senior's words, and even had a good impression or even admiration. And Ye Lingxian's background is extremely mysterious. She has probably been used to all kinds of sweet talk since she was a child. She will not be moved just because Musian gave her a snow lotus and said some nice words. At most, it will make her originally very bad impression of him a little better. This invitation letter is also a rare opportunity to get along. Although Musian had no interest in such a girl without a great heart, he was still a little curious about the power behind Ye Lingxian. Because once she passed the sect assessment, Ye Lingxian would enter Lianji section with her beauty, she would probably attract a lot of suitors soon. Then the question was, could she refuse Lan Mulian's invitation? She had been hiding in her nest like an ostrich before, and this time she finally took the initiative to go somewhere. If he refused her, he might not have such an opportunity to take his senior sister out in the future. It's not easy. Looking at the swaying snow lotus in the yard, Musian sighed. He had given snow lotus to Bairuoxi and others before, which was naturally a well-considered action. Bairuoxi was the kind of person who tended to be weak and cold, and she would not be competitive. If she was given snow lotus, she would not deliberately show it off. Lan Murian is also cold and aloof, but compared to Bairuoxi, she is a reserved and noble person. Although she occasionally expresses the feelings of a little girl in her letters, she will not mention the snow lotus. Moreover, the feelings between her and him are still very pure. Although there is a little ambiguity, it is far from the level of love between men and women. As for Ye Lingxian, let alone, the girl's opinion of him has not completely changed, and it is even more impossible for her to mention the snow lotus. However, now all these people want to go to the Dan auction house in 2 days to bid for the Liuguang soil and preserve the snow lotus for a long time. This is a big problem. He can't refuse all these people, because they are all very high-quality fish. If he refuses, the fish may swim out of the pond. But if all 3 of them accept, it seems a bit too busy. Even a master of time management would have a hard time dealing with this. Musian thought of this, looked at the snow lotuses in the pond swaying in the wind under the soft moonlight, and couldn't help but sigh, saying, "Sister Mengru, why do you think our Mu family is planting snow lotuses?" Beside him, The tall and charming Wei Mengru quietly appeared from the shadows since some time, and glanced at him coldly. If you hadn't picked the snow lotus in the yard and gave it away, would it have become like this now? When he said this, there seemed to be a hint of gloating in his cold tone in the past. Musian looked up at her and noticed the contempt in the eyes of the maid. Instead of being annoyed, he smiled knowingly. He imagined that if Wei Mengru was like a maid, she would have to stand in front of him with her skirt lifted up by both hands under his order, staring at him with humiliation and contempt in her eyes. Tisk tisk, just imagining that scene makes people's hearts beat. Wei Mengru said coldly, "Do you want to get close to the snow lotus in the pool?" Did she realize that I had some thoughts about her? Musian was slightly startled, but soon he was relieved. That's right, because of some things that happened to Wei Mengru in the past. After entering the realm of soul refining, she could feel the malice of others more clearly. However, he didn't have any malice towards Wei Mengru. He just simply imagined how the maid would react after teasing her. Although this imagination is not very realistic now. However, it may not be the case in the future. Musian thought of this and suddenly said, "Sister Mengru, you said the snow lotus. This snow lotus represents loyalty and purity to feelings, very similar to me." Wei Mengru glanced at Musian lightly and asked. Musian shook his head and smiled. "What I mean is, if this snow lotus is picked, how long will it take for it to wither? The time that the Mu mansion has cultivated snow lotus is actually not that long, and Musian in the past didn't pay attention to this thing at all, so naturally he didn't know how long it would take for the snow lotus to wither." Wei Mengru thought for a moment after hearing this, and said, "It can be as short as 5 days, or as long as 10 days. Musian was slightly startled and said, "Are there any exceptions?" Wei Mengru shook her head and said, "At least none of the snow lotuses picked by the Mu mansion withered in less than 5 days. That's a bit strange." Musian frowned slightly and said to himself, "I remember the snow lotus I gave to my senior sister a few days ago. I forgot the exact number of days, but it definitely didn't exceed 5 days. But when he brought the second snow lotus to the inn, the snow lotus in the vase had already withered. Is it related to the change of environment, or, the snow lotus was not given to Lan Murian by him, but the artificial snow lotus cultivated by Yang Fengyin? If so, where did the snow lotus that he gave to his senior sister go?" Wei Mengru said lightly, "Since you regret it now, you shouldn't have given so many snow lotus to other girls." Musian came back to his senses, nodded slightly, and said, "Indeed, I will only give snow lotus to Sister Mengru in the future." Wei Mengru said and said lightly, "I don't need it." She paused and continued, "If you want to pick it yourself, it's fine." "The meaning is completely different," Musian said. "What are you going to do now?" "Accept all 4 invitations," Wei Mengru asked. By Ruoxi, Huang Manting, the Yes sisters, and Lan Murian, the examinee who came down from the mountain of Lianji sect, despised Musian's multi-threaded operation, but she was also curious about how Musian wanted to end it now. "It's actually very simple, as long as you don't accept any of them," Musian smiled. "Are you going to reject all of them?" "No need to reject them." Musian published contradictory literature again. "I really can't solve this problem." Musian raised his head and glanced at Wei Mengru, but because of his great heart, it was difficult to see that delicate face. He retracted his gaze, turned his head to look at the snow lotus in the pond, and smiled, "But I can solve the problem itself." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 66. The problem itself is the batch of Liuguang soil that can preserve snow lotus for a long time. The girls wanted to go to the auction house not for novelty, but simply to bid for the Liuguang soil. For the girls, Master Mu went to the people of the Don Chamber of Commerce in advance to negotiate and get 3 handfuls of Liuguang soil. Doesn't it sound very touching? Hearing this, Wei Mengru looked at Musian's calm smile, as if he was planning a strategy, and raised her eyebrows slightly. After a moment of silence, she seemed to understand something and asked, "Do you want to attack that batch of Liuguang soil directly?" Musian shook his head and said, "It would be too obvious to attack directly, but it is not difficult to ask for 3 handfuls of Liuguang soil in advance." Wei Mengru saw what he meant and immediately looked at him with contempt, saying coldly, "If you are hunted by them one day, I will not save you." Musian smiled and said, "Sister Mengru, don't be so heartless, didn't my mother ask you to protect me?" Wei Mengru glanced at Musian and said, "Madam said that I should protect your safety, but it doesn't count if you commit suicide yourself. Bairuoxi's cultivation speed is very fast now. In a few months, she will reach the realm of refining spirits, and I may not be able to protect you," Wei Mengru continued. Musian asked in confusion, "Even with Ruoxi's talent, how many months will it take to reach the soul refining realm?" Wei Mengru nodded slightly. "There is an insurmountable gap between the peak of Qi refining and the soul refining realm. Some people may not be able to break through even if they retreat for several years. It does not depend on the talent for cultivation, but on the individual's ability to comprehend. A few months is considered fast." "How long did it take Sister Mengru to break through Qi refining?" Musian asked. "Half a month," Wei Mengru said lightly. She paused and added, "I just happened to be lucky. I saw 2 soul refining realm monsters fighting in a forest at that time, and I felt enlightened. Otherwise, it would take 2 or 3 months. You happened to encounter a chance and then you were promoted to the soul refining realm. Could it be that you are also the chosen one? This is also because Sister Mengru has a good talent and her own efforts. God rewards hard work." Musian threw a bait. The maid did not bite the hook. There was no fluctuation on her face. She glanced at Musian lightly, turned around and left the yard. "My young master is indeed very smart. It is not an exaggeration to say that he has made every possible plan so far. However, how can human emotions be controlled by calculation? Moreover, it is a girl's emotion. Wei Mengru knows everything, but she just won't say it. She is now hoping that her young master will fail. As for the reason, naturally, there is no need to say more, she just thinks he deserves a beating." Musian has become accustomed to Wei Mengru's cold response, so he just smiled and watched Wei Mengru leave. "Let's go to the dawn auction tomorrow," Musian thought to himself, feeling the slight chill of the night wind blowing across his cheeks, and got up and left the yard. Quietly pushed open Bairuoxi's room. The girl with a weak temperament in a white dress sat cross-legged on the bed with her eyes slightly closed. The room was filled with spiritual energy purified by the energy of heaven. "Don't wait until I reach the 4th level of Qi training when she has already reached the spirit refining realm," Musian thought silently as he looked at Bairuoxi's beautiful face. He didn't have much to do with cultivation. He was originally positioned as a supporting role, and he was the supporting role who was slapped in the face by the protagonist in the novice village at the beginning. Although he had good talent as a supporting role, he had wasted so much time in the past, and it was impossible for him to become a big fat man at once. Cultivation can only be done slowly. Unless he is like Yayu, who can have some great opportunity or something like that. In fact, if you have to say it, it seems that there really is such an opportunity. Bronze pieces, heavenly Qi, these are the opportunities he worked hard to win, but he can't use all of these opportunities. But it doesn't matter, it's enough for Bairuoxi to get these opportunities. Bairuoxi is a relatively gentle and obedient good girl. If she can step into the realm of spirit refining or even the realm of land immortal in the future, it will not be a waste of these opportunities. As for the enlightenment realm and even the combination realm, it is a bit too far away. Anyway, as long as you can reach the return to void realm, you can walk sideways in the entire Xiangxia world. Muzian thought of this, retracted his gaze, and sat cross-legged at the foot of the bed. Although his cultivation speed is not as exaggerated as Bairuoxi, at least when he is with her, his cultivation speed will also be much faster than that of normal cultivators. Muzian is a person who knows how to be content. After all, he is just a supporting villain in the early stage, and you can't expect him to have the talent like Yayu all of a sudden. Yayu only needs to work hard to become stronger, because he is the son of heaven. But if Muzian wants to become stronger, he needs to spend more thoughts. What he needs to do is not just hard work, but also use his brain to find ways to fleece Yayu, the fat sheep. After all, he is the son of heaven, and there should be a lot of wool to fleece. Even if you can't use the things you get for free, you can give them to people around you. The next morning, Bairuoxi, who was meditating, uttered a soft and lazy moan. Her thick and curled eyelashes trembled slightly, and Bairuoxi slowly opened her beautiful eyes. She had been meditating for a whole night, but her body was not tired at all, but refreshed. She could clearly feel that she had touched the threshold of the spirit refining realm. Although he is still practicing the 9th level of Qi training, he has already gained some insights into the realm of divine refining. After reaching the peak of Qi refining, I am afraid that I will be able to advance to the God refining realm very quickly. This is not the blessing brought by the Qi of heaven, but by Ruoxi's own talent and perception ability. This fact made her overjoyed. She bent her knees slightly and stepped on the ground with her white toes. As soon as she got out of bed, she happened to see Muzian sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed and meditating. That handsome profile quickly caught Bairuoxi's attention. Not only men like beautiful women, but girls also like handsome people of the opposite sex. Of course, compared to women, generally speaking, as long as a man is neater and tidier and has a higher emotional intelligence, he can still please a girl even if he doesn't have to be handsome. But because Muzian is good-looking and speaks well, it is easier to attract girls. As soon as Bairuoxi got out of bed, Muzian seemed to notice her gaze. He opened his eyes, looked at Bairuoxi quietly, and said with a smile, "Good morning, Ruoxi." Bairuoxi said shyly, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Mu. Why are you still calling Mr. Mu? It's time to change your name." Muzian gently grabbed Bairuoxi's soft little hand. The eldest daughter of the Bai family blushed slightly, stood with her head bowed, gently clasped Muzian's warm palm with her little hand, and said in a soft voice, "Mr. Mu, good morning." "This is right." Muzian felt more comfortable and said with a smile, "How was your practice last night?" Bairuoxi hesitated and said, "It's not bad." Her eyes were shining brightly, and she was about to tell Muzian that she had reached the threshold of the God refining realm. But at this time, Muzian was the first to comfort him, "Don't be anxious, just take your time. Sister Mengru told me last night that it takes time to settle down and gain self-awareness to advance to the God refining realm. You are still practicing at the 9th level of Qi, this kind of thing cannot be rushed." Although Bairuoxi's talent is good, he is still worried that the girl will get the wrong idea. After all, the realm of refining the gods depends not only on talent, but also on self-perception. How can it be that easy? But I already had some insights into refining the gods in advance. Bairuoxi wanted to say this, but looking at the young man's handsome face and his concerned eyes, she finally held back what she was saying. Also, with the Qi of heaven, my cultivation speed is still so slow, and there is really nothing to show off. Wait until you enter the God refining realm in 2 days before telling him. I can also give him a surprise then. "Are you going out today too?" Bairuoxi suddenly asked. Muzian smiled and nodded, "I'll prepare a gift for you." "A gift?" Bairuoxi tilted her head slightly and repeated doubtfully. "What gift?" Muzian deliberately kept it secret. "Let's not talk about it for now. I will tell you later." Let's talk now, Byruoxi asked curiously. There was a hint of coquettishness like a little girl in her usually cold expression, which made Musian feel a little excited. However, the eldest lady did not realize how tempting her coquettishness was, and she still looked into Musian's eyes, hoping that he would answer. Musian raised his hand and gently touched Byruoxi's smooth and flawless face, and said softly, "Kiss me now and I will tell you." "What are you talking about so early in the morning?" Byruoxi's cheeks turned slightly red and she gave Musian an angry look. Although her strength is comparable to that of the god of refining, when it comes to emotions, Byruoxi is probably only at the level of the refining realm. Musian looked at her, with a cool and perfect profile, a straight nose, and a small cherry mouth. A girl like this, who looks cold and weak but is naturally charming, looks extremely alluring when she is shy. Musian took half a step forward, kissed her delicate face gently, and deliberately teased, "If someone sees it, they might think it's me threatening you." Byruoxi's cheeks turned redder and she tried to change the subject, saying, "Can you tell me what gifts you are going to buy now?" Musian shook his head and smiled, "What I said just now doesn't count. I asked you to kiss me, not me to kiss you." Byruoxi glanced at him, became unhappy, and pushed him away gently, "Forget it if you don't tell me. You can leave quickly. I will continue to practice later. Let me give you a reward for working so hard." Musian gently held Byruoxi's waist and let her lean into his arms. "What kind of reward is this?" Byruoxi gave Musian a symbolic push, but she twisted her waist in his arms and acted coquettishly. After the two communicated intimately in the room for a while, Musian left the room with satisfaction. He was going to the dawn auction to find Fei Ying's backstage operation and buy some glazed soil. This is not a difficult task. The eldest young master of the Mu family will give some face to everyone in Tianqian City. Dawn Auction House. Lan Feiying was sitting lazily on the chair, with her legs crossed. Her body tightly wrapped in the cheongsam outlined perfectly sexy and plump curves. Her long, snow-white legs were tight. The tight-fitting cheongsam gave the woman a very sexy figure. Alluring and voluptuous figure. She was holding a teacup in one hand and drinking tea leisurely. At this time, a servant suddenly walked into the side hall and said in a low voice, "Miss Feiying, the eldest young master of the Mu family is looking for you." Musian. There was a trace of doubt in Lan Feiying's eyes, and then a charming smile appeared on her face. "Please invite him in. It just so happened that there was nothing going on at the auction in the morning, so I just wanted to pass the time." Not long after, under the leadership of his servant, Musian walked into the side hall and saw the woman wearing a cheongsam. Today she was wearing a raven black cheongsam embroidered with plum blossoms. The skirt reached her thighs. The black dress made the woman's skin whiter and smoother. "Sister Fei Ying has become more beautiful." Musian looked up and down and sighed. Lan Feiying glanced at him charmingly and said, "She knows how to say things to make girls happy." Musian smiled and said, "I'm just telling the truth." Lan Feiying made a cup of tea for Musian. After he sat down, she held her cheeks in her hands and looked at him. She asked, "I haven't seen you come here to chat with my sister on weekdays. There must be something going on." Bar. "I don't bother you just because I know Sister Feiying is busy with her affairs." Musian took a sip of tea and continued, "If Sister Feiying has free time later, I will invite you to Kai Inn for pastries. The Osman thus there is the cake tastes good." Osman thus cake. Lan Feiying pondered Musian's words, with a charming curve on her lips, and said in a soft voice, "Speaking of which, I just ate that sweet-scented Osman thus cake last night. The Osman thus cake at Kai Inn always requires a reservation. Does it seem like Sister Feiying knows the owner there?" Musian asked. Lan Feiying shook her head and said with a slightly teasing smile, "It was given by someone else." Musian asked curiously, "Is it a boy or a girl?" Lan Feiying glanced at Musian meaningfully and said, "Man." However, It can also be said to be a woman. The boy bought a sweet-scented Osman thus cake for a certain girl, and I happened to have a good relationship with that girl, so I ate some at her place. Lan Fading continued to explain. Seeing the thoughtful look in Musian's eyes, Lan Fading inadvertently changed the subject and said, "By the way, why did you come to see my sister? It's not as simple as just coming to chat with her, right?" Musian came back to his senses and said with a smile, "I'm mainly here to chat with my sister, and I want something by the way." Fei Ying smiled sweetly, "What do you want?" "I heard that at the auction house the day after tomorrow, there will be a batch of glazed soil that can preserve flowers for a long time," Musian asked knowingly. Fei Ying raised her eyebrows and said, "What do you want Lu Guangtu to do?" Musian did not explain, just said, "Sister, can you sell me some privately?" Lan Fading looked Musian up and down, narrowed her eyes and smiled, "If the quantity you want is not large, there is no problem. But I am still curious about what your purpose is in wanting glazed Tuesday." "I'll tell you next time," Musian said. "Oh." Lan Fading glanced at him, obviously not believing it. She turned to ask, "How much glazed soil do you want?" Musian pondered for a moment and said, 5 portions. Although there are only 3 people who need glazed light earth, 2 copies are kept as spares, which may come in handy in the future. Lan Fading slightly raised her arrogant snow-white chin and signaled her servants to go down and make arrangements. 5 portions of glazed soil is not too much, and she can indeed open a back door for Musian privately. In fact, she probably guessed what Musian wanted to do. But seeing through doesn't mean telling the truth. But then again, what he just said was that he wanted 5 portions of glazed earth. This amount is a bit concerning. Lan Fading narrowed her eyes slightly and began to think secretly. In the afternoon, Musian returned to Mu Mansion facing the sunshine. He saw Bairuoxi admiring the snow lotus in the yard. She was strolling leisurely by the pond. A thin ribbon around her waist outlined her slender water snake waist, and also highlighted her plump breasts, outlining a figure that was charming in ancient and modern times. It was alluring. Extremely. Bairuoxi looked slightly sideways, and when she saw Musian, a faint smile appeared on her face. Musian also smiled at her, then came to Bairuoxi's side and took out a delicate small box. "What is this?" Bairuoxi looked at the box Musian handed to her and asked subconsciously. "Open it and take a look," Musian said with a smile. Under Musian's gaze, Bairuoxi opened the box. There was a handful of sand stored in the box. Its appearance was like twinkling stars, making people's eyes involuntarily attracted at first sight. "This is glazed soil." Bairuoxi raised her head slightly, with a look of surprise in her eyes. "So, he went to the auction house in the morning to buy this glazed soil." Bairuoxi raised her moist eyes with crystal luster and said softly, "Thank you. For you, everything is worth it." Ruoxi Musian looked at the girl affectionately. Then, he suddenly continued, "I recently discovered that the sweet-scented Osman thus cake at Kayahayan tastes good. I just made an appointment for 2 boxes today. I'll buy them and enjoy them with you tonight." There was a shy look in Bairuoxi's eyes, and she said softly, "Yeah." After she watched Musian's back leave, she looked down at the box in her hand and the star-like sand in the box, wondering what she was thinking. After a while, Wei Mengru walked out of the yard, looked at Bairuoxi, and noticed the box in her hand. She seemed to understand something and said, "Did he go to the auction house to buy the glazed soil and give it to you?" Bairuoxi looked unhappy, looked at the glazed soil in the box, and snorted softly, "I would rather buy the glazed soil early than accompany me to the auction that day. He just hopes that I will leave the day after tomorrow. Just go to the auction house, right?" The originally soft and weak face showed a hint of dissatisfaction. Wei Mengru looked at the scene and was silent for a moment. She felt an inexplicable sense of pleasure in her heart, but her face was still expressionless. She said, "What are you going to do?" Bairuoxi said coldly, he doesn't let me go, but I want to go. It's just Huang Manting. She can deal with Gongsun Cheng, and she can deal with Huang Manting as well. Miss Bai is not only superior to other women in terms of breast volume, but also invincible in terms of strength. Naturally, she is not inferior to Huang Manting. Wei Mengru looked at Miss Bai with a beautiful face silently, and the corners of her mouth inadvertently raised an attractive arc. So she had said it long ago, never try to guess people's hearts, especially women's hearts. When women are in love, their IQ is negative. But when catching an adulterer, he. What a naive man. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 67. After giving one of the Liu Guangtu to Lan Murian, Musian took a carriage to the Mu mansion. Senior sister Lan didn't like crowded places by nature. Similarly, she didn't want to go to the auction house. She only planned to go there for the Liu Guangtu. In other words, with the Liu Guangtu, there was no point for her to go to the auction house. Rather than taking her to a crowded place, it would be more practical to take her to a quieter place next time. As for Ye Lingxian, Musian didn't go to the Ye mansion. After all, he originally planned to have a chance to contact Ye Lingxian, and this was a rare opportunity. After meeting Huang Manting, he would contact the sisters of the Ye family and test Ye Lingxuan's depth. After saying goodbye to Lan Murian, Musian sat in the carriage, thinking about such things in his heart, and unknowingly returned to the Mu mansion. When he opened the door, he happened to see the servant who had caused him trouble twice today was about to enter the yard. The attendant obviously noticed someone behind him, turned his head and immediately said respectfully, "Young master." Musian nodded slightly, glanced at the attendant, and said, "Do you realize your mistake?" The attendant was dissatisfied, but did not dare to get angry, and said innocently, "Young master, what did I do wrong?" "The servants of our Mu mansion always step into the yard with their right foot first, but you raise your left foot first," Musian said seriously. The attendant was confused and had some doubts in his heart. When did this rule come into the Mu mansion? Reflect on it carefully. After Musian finished speaking, he no longer paid attention to the attendant's surprised eyes, walked into the yard leisurely, and walked along the corridor to Bairuoxi's guest room. The attendant touched the back of his head and looked at the direction where Musian left in confusion. Until now, he still didn't understand what the young master had just said. At this time, a companion came over and whispered, "Young master means that you should know how to read the master's face and act accordingly in the future." These servants work in the mansion, not just to complete their tasks, but sometimes they also need to understand the atmosphere. Musian's temper is already quite good. If he were in the Gongsun family or even the Chenexai Chamber of Commerce, he would probably pack up and leave the next day after being treated like this by the servants. The servant was slightly surprised, and when he looked at Musian again, there was a little more gratitude in his eyes. With Musian's status, there was no need to remind him of such things, but the other party was willing to spend some time to remind him, which made him flattered. But then again, it feels like the young master has really changed a lot. He used to go to the Jiao Fangxi and the brothel, but he seems to have never been there these days, the servant suddenly said in a low voice with emotion. Now that Miss Bai lives in the Mu mansion, Mr. Mu doesn't need to go to such places, the companion replied. But he seemed to go to Yangfeng Inn in the afternoon, the attendant whispered. If I remember correctly, the examiner of Lianji sect this time is there. SHH, don't discuss this kind of thing, we don't need to know so much, the companion reminded. The two looked at each other and stopped, entangled in this matter. In the master's house, it is natural not to discuss the master's private affairs. Especially such a secret matter. Musian quietly opened the door and stepped into the room, and saw Bairuoxi sitting cross-legged at the head of the bed. She sat upright, with her tied-up black hair hanging down in strands. Under her snow-white neck, the delicate and attractive collarbone could be vaguely seen, and below was the heart that was difficult to control. Is she hoping to reach the peak of chi refining quickly to ensure that she can pass the sect assessment? Musian looked at the woman's pride that could not be concealed by the thin clothes, and his heart was slightly clear. In fact, Bairuoxi was a little too worried. With her current strength, there is no one who can compare with her among the cultivators in the same chi refining realm. Because Bairuoxi was still meditating, Musian did not disturb her, but sat cross-legged beside Bairuoxi, also slightly closed his eyes. According to the current progress, he felt that he should be able to break through the fourth level of chi training in the next few days. Time passed quickly, and the day of the auction came unknowingly. This morning, Musian changed his clothes and arranged his robes in front of the bronze mirror. That handsome face seemed to be a little tired. This is no wonder. As a natural furnace, Musian has been devoting himself almost every day in the past 2 days to contribute his own efforts to Bairuoxi's practice. The contribution process is really boring, and it also makes Musian often hug Bairuoxi in the quilt and think about life in a boring way. After tidying up his robes, Musian turned his head and glanced at Bairuoxi lying on the bed. Under the thin quilt, the snow-white shoulders were faintly visible. She closed her eyes slightly and looked like she was sleeping particularly sweetly. It was obvious that it was caused by practicing too long and being too tired yesterday. Musian smiled knowingly and turned to leave the room. As the door quietly closed, Bairuoxi's eyelashes trembled, and then she slowly opened her eyes. Morning light auction. Musian came to a private room on the second floor that was decorated in a rather classical and gorgeous style, and met the rich lady from the Morning Light Chamber of Commerce. Huang Manting leaned lazily on the chair, her black hair was loose, her legs were crossed, and her black dress set off her snow-white skin. Her toes were hooked on the tips of her shoes under the skirt. She smiled and said, "Mr. Mu, you are quite punctual, you even arrived an incense stick early." Musian took a seat under the arrangement of the maid and smiled as well. "After all, I have already agreed to the invitation. I always like to arrive early." Huang Manting pursed her beautiful lips and smiled. "It seems that Mr. Mu and I are the same kind of people." Musian picked up the teacup and drank a sip of tea. He glanced at the guests who were coming in one after another and smiled. "While the auction has not started yet, why don't Miss Huang, how about getting straight to the point? I have something to do later." Huang Manting tapped the edge of the chair with her fingertips, took a sip of the teacup, and sighed faintly. "Mr. Mu, you really fooled Manting a few days ago. Don't you have anything to tell me about the past 2 days?" Musian pondered for a moment, smiled and nodded, and said, "Thank you Miss Huang for your help in the past 2 days. The family likes the 3 markets very much and has good reviews. The people of the Mu family are indeed very satisfied with the 3 markets of the Gongsun family. Although they are not located in a prosperous area, they are 3 markets after all, which can bring a considerable amount of extra water to the Mu family every month." Huang Manting's smile paused for a moment, and she stared at Musian with a faint gaze, saying, "You came to see me 2 days ago. Did you really fancy the 3 markets of the Gongsun family?" Musian took a sip of tea and said, "I really wanted to answer Miss Huang's doubts at that time. Instead of letting you slowly investigate my affairs, I might as well open the door and let you ask enough." Huang Manting stared at Musian's eyes. At this moment, she seemed to understand something, and there was a trace of anger in her eyes, as well as fear hidden deep in her heart. It is rumored that the eldest son of the Mu family is obsessed with beauty and is a good-for-nothing. She had met Musian several times before, and it was indeed as rumored. But what if the good-for-nothing image in the past was completely his disguise? Musian came to the Don Chamber of Commerce to find her 2 days ago, firstly for the 3 markets of the Gongsun family, secondly to warn her not to let the servants secretly investigate her affairs, and thirdly, it was revenge for being secretly investigated. Moreover, that day at the Don Chamber of Commerce, he had touched her for free. She thought she was teasing Musian at the time, but she didn't know that it was Musian who was teasing her. Huang Manting felt the anger in her chest burning uncontrollably, staring at Musian's eyes, and said, "Mr. Mu, you are really calculating. Miss Huang, I just help others for fun. You want to satisfy your curiosity, so I satisfy you. Isn't that enough?" Musian gently put down the teacup and said innocently, "I want to be a good person, but good people deserve to be bullied. If it weren't for our Mu family's spies who found out that someone was secretly investigating me, were you going to dig out my birth date and horoscope?" Huang Manting was speechless. She was in the wrong first in this matter, and Musian's subsequent actions were just small revenges, which really made people speechless. Many people who participated in the auction have come to the auction house one after another, and the noisy voices of those people can be vaguely heard in the private room. Silence permeated this elegant and classical private room. After a while, Huang Manting's face reappeared a charming smile, and she said faintly, "Privately investigate Mr. Mu, this matter is indeed Manting's fault, I offer you a glass." Musian raised his eyebrows slightly and smiled, "Tea instead of wine." Huang Manting smiled, "I will invite Mr. Mu to our Chamber of Commerce to drink someday. The Chenexai Chamber of Commerce brings all kinds of fine wines from various states. I heard that Uncle Huang has a lot of good wines. I am looking forward to it." Musian smiled. The atmosphere between the two seemed to become extremely relaxed all of a sudden, and people could not feel the previous smoke at all. "But there is something that makes me sad." Huang Manting suddenly sighed faintly, "In your heart, Manting is not as good as 3 markets, Mr. Mu." Mingming even gave people a feeling of accusing Musian in her words, but her voice sounded soft, and it made people feel like she was acting coquettishly, which made people's bones soften. Musian turned to look at her and saw that her eyes were moist and pitiful, and with that charming face with a little makeup, it was indeed heartwarming. Musian showed a gentle smile, "The 3 markets cannot be compared with you. Then why did Mr. Mu use me?" Huang Manting's voice was still soft and sweet, but for some reason, the atmosphere in the private room had a little more dangerous atmosphere. Musian gently put down the teacup and sighed, "Miss Huang, according to what you said that day, you want me to be your Taoist partner, right?" "No," he shook his head and continued, "with Miss Huang's personality, if I am with you in the future, I am afraid I will have to work like a cow and a horse for you. But you want the horse to run, but you don't give it grass. What do you think is more in line with the interests, compared to the grass far away and the market close at hand?" Musian asked. Huang Manting narrowed her eyes slightly, and gently placed her fair, soft, slender jade hand on the back of Musian's hand. The nails on her fingertips gently scratched the back of his hand, making people feel itchy. "So if I give Mr. Mu the corresponding benefits, you will choose me instead of Miss Bairuoxi?" Musian calmly withdrew his hand and said with a smile, "Of course, with Miss Huang's charm, if there is an interest that can make me excited, I know who to choose." Looking at Musian's stubborn expression at this time, and recalling the shy look of Musian when facing her that day, Huang Manting's smile on her face was almost difficult to maintain, and she felt as if her heart was pierced by a needle. Being teased to this extent, I'm afraid she would be laughed at if it got out. Huang Manting's tender white toes hooked the black embroidered shoes with cloud patterns, and she reached out and put her hand on the back of Musian's hand again, and said softly, "Miss Ruoxi knows that we are so intimate in the same private room, she shouldn't be angry, right?" "That won't happen, she is still very confident in her beauty." Musian smiled. If it were normal times, Musian would probably take the bait and play with Huang Manting for such a teasing. However, after staying in Bairuoxi's room for a long time in the past 2 days, he has temporarily lost that worldly desire. Moreover, Bairuoxi's family background is not inferior to Huang Manting, and her appearance is a few points higher than Huang Manting, and even her figure curves are also higher than hers. In addition, Her cold and weak temperament that easily arouses men's desire to protect her, there is no need to consider who to choose. Huang Manting looked down at the auction venue below the stage from a high position in the private room, and suddenly changed the topic and said, Master Mu, what are your plans after entering Lianji sect in a few days? What other plans can there be? Just do what you should do. Are you planning to set up another sect in Lianji sect? Muzian made a joke. Huang Manting shook her head and said, after entering Lianji sect, our identities in Tianqian city will naturally not be of much use. I think we can help each other at that time. What can I, a little cultivator who is not even a 4th grade Qi training, do you know? Muzian laughed dumbly. Just help when you can, but when you can't. Huang Manting paused, took a sip of tea, raised her bright eyes and looked at him, and said softly, you can help me too. Click. Suddenly, Huang Manting's embroidered shoes with her toes hooked fell to the ground, accompanied by a crisp sound, which seemed to add a hint of inexplicable ambiguity to the atmosphere in the private room. Huang Manting lowered her eyes and looked at her toes, and said softly, I won't ask Mr. Mu to leave Miss Bai, just come and accompany me occasionally. Muzian stared straight at this charming profile, and after a long silence, he said, Miss Manting's suggestion is really touching. Huang Manting's eyebrows were soft, and she looked at him sideways and said, so you accepted it? Seeing Muzian's obsessed eyes, she already knew the result, but she still wanted to hear Muzian say it himself. A beautiful woman took the initiative to say these words, and any man would be unable to resist the temptation. And this was exactly the first step for Muzian to fall into the trap. At the beginning, he said, I don't intend to break up your Taoist couple, but in the end, Muzian would enjoy the excitement of sneaking around with other girls, and even fall under her pomegranate skirt in the end. Huang Manting really knows a lot about men. Under Huang Manting's direct gaze, Muzian nodded gently. Before Huang Manting's smile fully bloomed, he heard him continue, I refuse. Looking at the smile frozen on Huang Manting's face, Muzian drank the tea and stood up. There was a trace of anger in Huang Manting's charming eyes. She suppressed her anger and tried to keep him, Mr. Mu, the auction is about to start, don't you want to stay and watch? I have an appointment later, so I won't waste your time. Muzian smiled. Under Huang Manting's dim gaze, Muzian happily opened the curtain and left the private room. If you really accept Huang Manting's temptation, you can take advantage of her at the beginning. However, if you really want to get a woman like this, you will definitely have to pay a huge price. And compared to Miss Wang's rouge, Ruoxi's rouge is indeed more delicious. Muzian stood in front of the corridor on the 2nd floor, casually scanning the rows of seats under the stage, looking for the figures of the Yes sisters. However, after searching for a long time, he did not find Ye Lingxian and Ye Qian. Strange, have the Yes sisters not come yet? Or are they also in the private room on the 2nd floor? Muzian just thought of this. At this time, the corner of his eye suddenly fell in front of a private room not far away on the 2nd floor. In front of the private room, he saw a beautiful woman wearing a moon-white long skirt and a veil on her face. Her clear eyes like ice in the pond made people unforgettable at first sight. Lan Murian. Damn, why is senior sister here? According to senior sister's personality, she shouldn't like such a lively place, but why? Muzian stopped abruptly, hesitated for a while, turned around and planned to go downstairs in another direction. However, as soon as he turned around, he saw another familiar figure not far behind him. Ruoxi, who was wearing a plain palace skirt and had a gentle temperament, was talking to Wei Mengru. The two of them looked around, as if looking for something. Muzian was silent for a moment, then turned around and lifted the curtain and returned to the private room. Huang Manting raised her head and looked at him coldly without saying anything. Miss Huang, I'm back. Muzian was not embarrassed. He greeted her with a smile and then sat back in his original position. Didn't Master Mu plan to go back? Did he change his mind? Huang Manding's voice was cold. Her pretty face was no longer calm as before. Her face was covered with frost. Well, something unexpected happened. Musian answered absent-mindedly and fell into a long period of thinking. He suddenly realized that things seemed to be gradually out of his control. Huang Manding, who was standing aside, had already regained her composure. She supported her cheek with her hand and looked at Musian meaningfully. Seeing a trace of sadness in his eyes, she couldn't help but narrow her eyes slightly. Something was wrong. He had just planned to leave, but he suddenly turned back, looking at this. Is there something else outside that can scare Master Mu? So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 68. While Musian was still thinking about whether he should leave early, the auction had already officially started. A plump and charming woman came to the stage. She was wearing a black cheongsam and had a pair of charming eyes. She glanced at the guests around her and smiled as she began her opening remarks. This feeling is a bit like a modern host. Musian looked at Fei Ying in front of the stage on the second floor and couldn't help thinking in his heart. At the same time, his eyes were also scanning the private seats below the stage, which were almost separated by an empty seat, looking for Ye Lingxuan's figure. It seems that I should have been stood up, or is she also in the private room on the second floor? Musian thought in his heart. But if she is in the private room, it will be difficult to find her. It is impossible to ask in each private room, right? Not to mention that this is not very efficient, and the risk is too great. After all, he just told his senior sister 2 days ago that he had something to do today. If he ran into her here, it would be embarrassing. Musian suddenly asked, Miss Huang, do you know who are in these private rooms today? Huang Manding glanced at him and said lightly, these things are handled by the servants. I don't pay attention to these things. Seeing that Musian suddenly lost interest in her, Huang Manding continued, but I can ask someone to prepare a list for you, but Mr. Mu must first explain what you want to do. I'm looking for someone, Musian said. Who? Miss Huang asked too many questions. Our relationship is not that good yet, Musian smiled. Huang Manding said, in that case, Mr. Mu should think about how to find someone by himself. If you search one private room after another, you will find someone, right? But by then, the auction may be over. Miss Huang, help more people in need, and you will feel better, Musian persuaded with a smile. Huang Manding raised her eyebrows slightly, sat lazily on the chair, played with a strand of hair, and said lightly, if it was other friends who asked for help, I would help, but I am not so familiar with Master Mu, right? She paused, changed her tone, and swayed her feet in black embroidered shoes, teasing, or, if Master Mu kneels down now to clean Manding's toes, it is not impossible to consider it. The beauty's toes are slightly arched, outlining a nearly perfect arc, matched with the flawless snow-white long legs under the black skirt, a kind of enchanting beauty. Musian glanced at her inadvertently, and noticed the playful eyes of this enchantress again, and smiled, you are anxious. It is obvious that Huang Manding has been annoyed, and she is completely different from the indifferent demeanor at the beginning. If it is normal, Huang Manding would never say such words directly in front of outsiders. While the two were chatting, the goods under the stage had been pushed to the front of the high platform one by one, and they were sold at high prices with Fei Ying's smiles. Some goods may not be really worth this price, but with Lan Fei Ying's blessing, these goods were sold at such a price. The goods sold below are also somewhat special. It is said that it is a medicinal material left over from thousands of years ago. Although only a small piece of roots are left now, if we can find the water of reincarnation, we may be able to restore its original medicinal effect. Starting price, 100 spirit stones. As soon as these words came out, everyone's interest was immediately dull. there is a default rule in the Dawn auction house that things that are not valuable or whose prices are unknown will start at 100 spirit stones. Many similar things have been auctioned in the past, and most of them are basically waste, which is even worse than garbage. If the waste that appeared in the auction house every time was some ancient divine object, the monks would have scrambled for it long ago, and would not give the protagonist a chance at all. It is precisely because they have suffered several losses and been fooled countless times in the past that the monks have no interest in these waste products. 100 spirit stones are not much, but Musion does not intend to be fooled. Let alone whether this thing is true or false, even if it is true, the value of the reincarnation water itself is probably not inferior to the so-called roots handed down from ancient times. The reincarnation water is something located in a forbidden area in Dongzhou. Most monks who enter the forbidden area never return. In the past, there were also people who were very lucky and left the desolate forbidden area alive with the reincarnation water. However, they had just handed the reincarnation water to the auction house for auction, intending to enjoy it in the future, but they died strangely not long after. There is a curse in the forbidden area. So far, no one has survived the curse after entering the forbidden area. When the guests participating in the auction heard the 3 words reincarnation water, their faces did not change, and they all lost interest in the roots. Fei Ying glanced at the audience and was not surprised to see that they were all uninterested. She smiled charmingly. Next, count down 3 times. If no one bids, this item will be sold unsold. Fei Ying opened her lips slightly and said, 3. 110 spirit stones. A calm voice suddenly came from the audience, and everyone's eyes fell, and their sight soon fell on the young man who spoke. Yayu from the Ye family. Musion also looked over. Is Yayu here too? I didn't notice him before. And looking at the changes in him, he has already reached the Qi training stage. I'm not sleepy anymore. Musion is a little interested. Yayu would not auction off this withered root for no reason, it should be the old man in Yayu's body who reminded him. Huang Manting also looked sideways, and her eyes fell on Yayu. Originally, the next plan of the eldest lady of the Huang family was to win over Yayu before the sect assessment. This genius boy of the Ye family was promoted from the refining essence to the training Qi realm in just a few months. Such a talent is also worth her winning over. However, Yayu and Musion have a bad relationship. If Yayu is won over, he will gradually drift away from Musion. Although it feels a bit masochistic to say this, if it weren't for being played by Musion 2 days ago, Huang Manting would have already started the plan to win over Yayu. But because of what happened 2 days ago, after thinking for a long time, Huang Manting finally chose Musion. It's not just because Musion is smart. Huang Manting likes the pleasure of conquering others. The more Musion ignores her, the more she wants him. In the past, there were many men who pretended to be indifferent and wanted to counter-trap, but they fell at Huang Manting's feet after a few moves. She would hate such a man even if he knelt beside her and licked the tip of her shoes. What she wanted to see was a servant who was really not interested in her being conquered by her, kneeling at her feet and kissing her jade feet. The man who had the most beautiful woman in Tianqian City as his Taoist partner was secretly the servant of the eldest lady of the Huang family, kneeling by the bed every day and trying his best to please her. This feeling, just thinking about it makes people feel wonderful. Although this task seems a bit difficult at present. But this is challenging, isn't it? Bid me 120 spirit stones. Musion glanced at the maid next to Huang Manting and said. The maid didn't speak, but subconsciously glanced at Huang Manting. Hurry up, what are you still standing there for? Musion patted the maid's buttocks. The maid tentatively glanced at Huang Manting, with an infatuation and respect in her eyes, as if waiting for Huang Manting's answer. Mr. Mu has spoken, so why are you still standing there? Huang Manting replied lazily. If she refused the other party for such a small matter, Musion might leave the private room immediately, which would be detrimental to her plan. At the same time, as Yayu's voice fell, many cultivators in the crowd below the stage looked at Yayu intentionally or unintentionally, with a bit of sarcasm in their eyes. Why does this genius boy of the Ye family care so much about this useless waste every day? Last time it was a bronze piece, and this time it was a withered root. Yayu ignored the gazes of these people, and looked at the woman in front of the high platform calmly, suppressing the heat in his heart. According to the old man in the body, this root is indeed an ancient medicinal material left over from thousands of years ago, named Longten Whisk. Although Feiying said that the water of reincarnation is needed to restore the withered Longten Whisk, it is not true. People with alchemy talent are born with an affinity for plants. Longten Whisk can gradually recover as long as it stays on these alchemists, but it may take hundreds or even thousands of years. But there is another kind of elixir in the world that can accelerate the recovery of Longten Whisk. In other words, taking away this Longten Whisk and then refining the corresponding elixir can accelerate the recovery of Longten Whisk. These people do not understand the value of this Longten Whisk. Yayu sneered in his heart, but did not explain. Why not take Longten Whisk at the lowest price? 120 spirit stones. At this time, a crisp female voice suddenly came from a private room. Yayu narrowed his eyes slightly and raised his head slightly to look at the private room on the second floor that offered the price. Judging from the range of the other party's bid, it should be that he just wants to join in the fun, Yayu said in a deep voice, 130. 140 spirit stones. The smile on Yayu's face froze for a moment, and he realized the tit-for-tat from the owner of the private room. 200 spirit stones, Yayu said. 210. The maid's calm voice came from the private room again. There was a slight commotion in the crowd again, and people looked at the private room, secretly guessing the identity of the owner of the private room. Looking at the range of the other party's bid, it is better to say that he is tit-for-tat with Yayu than to say that he wants the withered roots. Yayu frowned and shouted again, 300 spirit stones. This is the limit of the price he can offer at present. This time he also auctioned some of the pills he refined, but now the pills have not been put on the auction, and he doesn't have so many spirit stones to bid. Why is there always someone to stop me? Yayu's fists clenched quietly, and there was an unknown anger burning in his heart. The bronze piece was auctioned off by Musian last time. After he returned, his master told him that the bronze sword that Bairuoxi sacrificed on the martial arts arena at that time might have evolved from the bronze piece. That time had already made Yayu resentful. He never thought that he would be forced to such a point. He knew that the item being auctioned was a good thing and no one else had discovered its value, but Musian suddenly appeared and confronted him. If it weren't for Musian, he should be the one who is invincible among his peers now. When Yayu thought of this, he slowly raised his head and looked at the private room, his eyes flickering slightly. Could it be that it was Musian again? Thinking of this, Yayu's hatred for Musian in his heart had reached an uncontrollable level, and his eyes were fixed on the private room. Musian drank a cup of tea leisurely, and when he heard that no one in the audience continued to bid, he couldn't help but laugh secretly. He used up nearly half of the 100,000 spirit stones he got from Mr. Huang last time, but he still had 50,000 left, which was a considerable fortune, enough for him to be extravagant for a long time. He didn't know what the root was for, but if Yayu wanted it, he would just fight with him for it. The chosen son is a big fat sheep, and there is still a lot of wool to be pulled from him. Musian took the teacup handed by the maid and drank the tea slowly. At this time, he suddenly heard a clear, sweet, and pleasant voice coming from not far away, 1,000 spirit stones. Musian subconsciously looked in the direction of the person following the auction. This voice, is Ye Lingxian. Is this to stand up for Yayu? Musian felt a little jealous. Then, he suddenly thought, if I bid, will she give up the auction? However, even if he thought about it, Musian would never bid on his own initiative even if he died. After all, if he just shouted, his presence in the auction house would be exposed immediately. You continue bidding, and keep bidding up no matter what the other party raises. Musian turned his head and looked at the maid beside him. After saying that, he put down the teacup, opened the curtain and left the private room. 1,100 spirit stones. 1,200. As the maid started bidding again, Lingxuan's voice came from a private room again. Musian's eyes narrowed slightly and fell on the private room in the corner, and he said to himself, "Is it over there?" He immediately quickened his pace and walked towards the private room where the Yes sisters were. At the same time, Ye Qian, who looked innocent and lovely, was sitting obediently in a spacious and tidy private room. She turned her head to look at the purple-dressed girl beside her and said softly, "Sister, why did you bid for that kind of thing?" "For brother Yeyu." Ye Lingxian glanced at her sister and said, "Brother Yeyu is a member of the Ye family after all. Although we have had no contact with him in these years, since he wants it, let's bid for it. It's better to give it to relatives around you than to give it to a stranger. She will leave Tianqian City soon, and it will be even more impossible for her to have any contact with Yeyu after that. Just treat it as a parting gift." Ye Qian was silent. Then, she muttered again, "I don't know where brother Mu went. He clearly made an appointment with us." Ye Lingxian said, "I have long seen that he is not a good person. How can we expect him to be on time?" Ye Qian took her sister's arm, glanced at her, and said, "Then why did you dress up so early in the morning?" Ye Lingxian smiled lightly, "Qianer, don't you dress up for such an important occasion." As she said, her fingers gently touched Ye Qian's soft and elastic lips, and said, "On the contrary, you always dress simply when you go out, but today you dress more exquisitely than me. Could it be, you dressed up specially for Musian?" Ye Lingxian smiled with narrowed eyes. Ye Qian lowered her eyes slightly and said softly, "What are you talking about, sister? My sister and I have the same reason, we just dressed up to attend the auction." Ye Lingxian saw Ye Qian's reaction clearly. She picked up the teacup, drank a sip of tea slowly, and continued, "No matter what you think, Musian is not a good person anyway. Didn't he not show up for the appointment today? Who knows, he might be with other women now." Ye Qian's face was a little disappointed, but she didn't say anything to defend herself. After all, it was a fact that Musian had an appointment with them but didn't show up. Maybe what my sister said was right. At this time, a new offer came from the private room not far away, 1,300 spirit stones. Such a price has far exceeded the psychological endurance limit of most young cultivators. It's not that they don't have so many spirit stones, but it's really not worth spending so many spirit stones for a withered root. 1,500. When Ye Lingxian heard the sound of the follow-up in the private room again, she frowned and got angry. Ye Qian gently placed her hand on the back of Ye Lingxuan's hand and said, "Sister, calm down. It's not worth spending so many spirit stones to buy a useless medicinal material. It's okay to help Yeyu because they played together for a while in the past, but it's not worth it if you spend too many spirit stones. I want to see what the other party's psychological tolerance is," Ye Lingxian said lightly. "It's obvious that this young lady from a mysterious force has become angry and is unwilling to give in." She opened her cherry mouth slightly and was about to speak again. At this time, the curtain was suddenly lifted. The two subconsciously looked up and saw a handsome young man standing in front of the private room. He smiled apologetically and said, "Sorry, we're late." Ye Lingxian was surprised at first, but soon her tone turned cold and she said lightly, "Mr. Mu, I thought you didn't plan to come. I didn't find you just now. If I hadn't heard your bid, I probably wouldn't have found you until the end of the auction," Musian said with a smile. After a pause, he continued, "If I don't come again, you might raise the price to tens of thousands. If you really raise it to tens of thousands, even I will feel a little pain," Musian added. The two sisters looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. It turns out that the one who was bidding with them just now was the eldest young master of the Mu family. At this moment in the audience, Yayu looked up at the sexy woman wearing a black cheongsam in front of the high platform, with an anxious look in his eyes. Strange, why didn't my sister follow me for the photo? Could it be that she didn't have enough spiritual stones on her body? If possible, he doesn't want the soaring dragon beard to fall into the hands of others under any circumstances, because it is a waste of natural resources. Only people with extremely high alchemy talents can warm and nourish the soaring dragon beard. Once photographed by others, the soaring dragon beard will just be junk. Only in his hands can Long Tangsyu be restored in the future, Yayu was so convinced in his heart. If that doesn't work, I can even ask Lingxian to borrow some spirit stones first. No matter what, I have to take a picture of the dragon beard first. This thing will definitely be a big help to me in the future. Yayu stared at the withered roots in front of the high platform with burning eyes. He made up his mind and walked quickly towards a certain place on the second floor. Walk to the elegant room. It should be here. I seem to have heard Lingxuan's voice coming from here just now. Yayu looked at the elegant room in front of him and stepped forward to lift the thin curtain. At this time, the voice inside came softly from the private room. Sister Qian'er, I told you that I've been looking for you everywhere since I entered the auction house. Don't you think that Sister Lingxian doesn't believe it, and you don't believe it either? You smell like other women's rouge. I'm afraid you just made out with a girl in Jiaofangxi or somewhere. Ya Lingxuan's voice was clear and clear. That's the smell of rouge on your body. If you don't believe me, just smell it. Master Mu, please respect yourself. Ya Lingxuan's tone was stern, but there was no hint of anger in his voice. Hearing the sounds of fighting coming from time to time in the private room, Yayu's heart sank and he suddenly opened the curtain. Equals 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 boundary line equals 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 equals. Asking for votes and blades. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 69. As Yayu lifted the thin curtain, the sound in the private room stopped abruptly, and the scene inside came into view. The quiet and elegant Ya Lingxian sat on the soft couch in the private room. She was in the beautiful age of youth, with eyebrows like distant black, cherry lips, and delicate features. The other girl next to her sat well behaved, wearing light clothes. Although she was 1 or 2 years younger than her sister, the slightly raised arc on her chest was much larger than that of her sister next to her, and her graceful figure was looming. They were of similar age, and the sisters sat together, while next to Yechian sat a rather handsome boy. The thin curtain was lifted, and the voices in the private room quieted down. Muzian looked up and saw Yayu. He was keenly aware of the other party's jealous eyes. He calmly put down the teacup and looked at the two of them, wondering, Miss Lingxian, have you made an appointment with anyone else? Ya Lingxian shook her head slightly, raised her head, and smiled reservedly. Brother Yayu, what's the matter? Yayu stared at Muzian, and his voice was full of anger, and said, why are you with him? Sister Lingxian and I have never been to the auction house, so we want to find someone to accompany us. Yechian said softly, I asked Brother Yayu several times before, but you were not free, so we didn't disturb Brother Yayu's practice. It's not that Yechian had not invited Yayu in the past, but Yayu refused on the grounds that he was practicing. He subconsciously thought that accompanying his cousin to the auction house was a waste of time, and they had no contact in the past. He waited until he had the talent to invite her, which inevitably made Ye Yu feel that his cousin was a bit snobbish. As for Ye Lingxian, she is a proud girl, and generally she won't take the initiative to invite others. If it wasn't for Ye Qian, Ye Lingxian wouldn't have written that letter to Musian. To put it bluntly, Ye Yu didn't want his sister to leave him, but he didn't want to spend time on her either. Ye Yu stared at Musian, who looked relaxed, and whispered, "You shouldn't look for him, he's not a good person." Ye Lingxian frowned slightly, but still maintained her usual politeness, saying, "Brother Ye Yu, Master Mu is my guest. If you have nothing to do, please go back first." After all, Musian was also her guest. Even if Ye Yu and Musian had any conflicts, they shouldn't have conflicts in such a public place. Ye Yu frowned and said, "If you ask me, I will take time to accompany you anyway. You are my sisters after all, and wasting some time is nothing." Originally, the two sisters were at Ye's house, which made Ye Yu subconsciously think that they would not leave, but today he saw them with Musian. This made Ye Yu finally feel a sense of crisis. Musian remained silent until he heard what Ye Yu said, and he almost couldn't help laughing. Ye Yu may not be a fool, but his emotional intelligence is probably really low. Taking time to accompany a girl is a waste of time. Even if you really think it's a waste of time, you can't say it directly. Want to pursue a girl but don't want to spend time. What kind of Asian protagonist is he waiting for the girl to pursue him? What's more, girls like Ye Qian and even Ye Lingxian are pursued by the opposite sex, and if you don't go, others will. Ye Lingxian was indeed a little uncomfortable in her heart, and whispered, "Brother Ye Yu, please go back first. Qianer is safe under my protection, and Master Mu will send us back to the Ye mansion when the time comes. Yes, after the auction, I will personally send them back." Musian raised his hand and gently rubbed Ye Qian's head, and smiled. "The Ye family's carriage is still parked outside. Although the carriage is a little small, Sister Lingxian and Sister Qianer are both very slender girls, so it shouldn't be too crowded." This simple sentence almost broke Ye Yu's defense. He imagined the scene in the carriage when they returned. For a moment, he looked at Musian with undisguised anger in his eyes. 1,700 spirit stones, is there anyone who can bid higher? At this time, Fei Ying's soft and pleasant voice suddenly came from the audience. Just now, 2 or 3 people raised the price one after another, which has already made the price of this dragon beard soar to 1,700 spirit stones. And hearing the bidding sound in his ears, Ye Yu also calmed down a little. Just now, he saw his two sisters being so close to Musian in the private room, and he was so angry that he almost forgot the real purpose of coming to Ye Lingxian. Compared with the dragon whiskers, other things are completely irrelevant. No matter how lustful Musian is, he will definitely not dare to touch Ye Lingxian and Ye Qian. The most urgent thing now is to bid for the dragon whiskers. This idiot has no idea of the true value of that thing. Ye Yu's eyes fell on Ye Lingxian and said, "Lingxian, do you have any extra spiritual stones?" Ye Lingxian frowned slightly and glanced at Musian subconsciously. She knew that Musian also wanted that whisker. If he borrowed money. Ye Yu saw Ye Lingxian's expression completely. He subconsciously looked at Musian and said, "It was you who was bidding with me just now." Musian smiled and said, "In fact, I am also a little interested in that whisker." Ye Yu's eyes suddenly turned cold. "What do you mean by interested in the whiskers?" This Musian is clearly targeting him. But he had no other options. With Musian's financial resources, he was completely incomparable. But even so, at least he had to make Musian bleed heavily once. Ye Yu looked at the elegant girl in purple skirt and said, "Lingxian, can you lend me some spiritual stones?" Ye Lingxian frowned slightly. Ye Yu's words pushed Ye Lingxian to the forefront. Lending the spirit stone to Ye Yu is equivalent to targeting Musian, but if he doesn't lend it, It doesn't seem to be a good idea. After all, they grew up together in the Ye family and never looked up. In fact, a smarter person should not have said this to Ye Lingxian at all. But Ye Yu obviously lost his mind after seeing Musian. He was targeted by Musian again and again. Now he sees his two younger sisters in the same room as him, and the jealousy in his heart is naturally difficult to extinguish. At this time, Ye Lingxian suddenly felt that her delicate hand placed under the table was quietly clenched by a warm palm. Her heartbeat slowed down a beat, and she subconsciously glanced at Musian, with a flash of anger in her eyes. But at this time, when Musian met her eyes, she nodded inadvertently. He meant to let me borrow brother Ye Yu's spiritual stone. Ye Lingxian understood what Musian meant, and was surprised for a while before slowly coming back to his senses, taking out a small box from the ring and handing it to Ye Yu. These are the 2,000 spiritual stones I carry with me. Let's lend them to brother Ye Yu first. There was already a hint of coldness in the voice that could repel people thousands of miles away. Ye Yu's originally frowning brows relaxed and he glanced at Musian, as if he wanted to see out of control anger in his eyes. However, Musian's expression remained calm and at ease, and he took a sip of tea slowly, as if he didn't care at all. Do you want to pretend to be a rich young man in front of Qianer and Lingxian, but they don't like any rich children? Ye Yu secretly laughed, took the box, and said with a smile, Lingxian, this I will return the 2,000 spirit stones to you when I return to Ye Mansion. He knew that Musian would continue to bid with him later, and the purpose of borrowing money now was to make Musian shed blood, and to show Musian that I am the one they really care about. Between Musian and him, Ye Lingxian and Ye Qian finally chose him instead of Musian. To put it bluntly, I just want to kill people and hurt my heart. When he returned to his seat, Ye Yu immediately raised his head and shouted, 2,300 spirit stones. Sure enough, the maid next to Huang Manting raised the price again, 2,400 spiritual stones. Ye Yu sneered secretly and did not increase the price this time. On the other side, Ye Lingxian turned to look at Musian, with a hint of apology in his eyes for the first time, and said, I'm sorry for costing you nearly 2,000 more spiritual stones. She originally just wanted to take the glazed earth at the auction house to relax, but she didn't want the people accompanying them to encounter such a bad thing. Ye Qian's eyes were also apologetic, and her brows were furrowed. Musian put down the teacup gently, shook his head and smiled, I have already said that the matter between Ye Yu and I has nothing to do with you, and you should not be involved. Sorry, I will return the 2,000 spirit stones to you when I go back, Ye Lingxian said. Ye Lingxian is an extremely smart girl, so she naturally knows that Musian is doing this for them. If spending an extra 2,000 spirit stones can help you get along harmoniously when you go back, it will be worth it, Musian said with a smile. This time it seemed that I spent 2,000 spirit stones, but in fact it was not. Glancing at Ye Lingxian, whose face was full of apologies, and Ye Qian, who seemed a little unhappy, Musian silently took a sip of tea. Then he poured a cup of tea for the two of them and said with a smile, don't be so gloomy. Since you are unhappy because of one thing, why can't you be happy because of another thing? Ye Lingxian's eyes softened slightly after hearing this. Thinking about it, although it makes me a little depressed because of the borrowing money. But if you think about it differently, there are people who think about her and are even willing to be taken advantage of. This kind of tenderness that penetrates like water can't help but warm people's hearts. Just return the 2,000 spirit stones to Musian later. To Ye Lingxian, that little spiritual stone was nothing. Ye Qian suddenly felt the back of her hand being lightly touched by a palm. Her heart skipped a beat and she glanced at Musian subconsciously. His handsome profile and high nose made him look like the brother next door. But my heart is moved. Ye Qian's eyes flashed slightly, and he glanced at his sister guiltily. He didn't break away, but just lowered his head and said nothing. It looks like the initial judgment is the same. Yechian belongs to the extremely innocent elementary school girl type, who can be easily conquered. As long as she can speak well and is good looking and treats her well, there will be no problem. At the same time, the soaring dragon beard that was auctioned in the audience was finally put into Musian's pocket for 2,400 spirit stones. Yayu raised his head and looked at a certain elegant room, and said with a smile, "Young Master Mu took 2,400 spirit stones to take a piece of waste. He is really heroic." In the private room, Musian was playing with Yechian's soft little hands. Hearing this, he first laughed secretly in his heart. Yayu, a fool, thought he was making money, but in fact, his whole house was stolen. Then, he suddenly remembered something important, and the smile gradually froze on his face. Damn it, that's not right. If it were normal, Musian would naturally win a big victory this time. However, I don't know if it was an illusion, but Musian vaguely seemed to hear someone in the private room outside gently lift the thin curtain. When he heard the footsteps approaching, Musian felt a cold feeling from head to toe. Yeah, you indeed won this time. This young man completely exposed the fact that he accompanied the Yes sisters at the auction house. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 70. In front of the high platform of the auction house, Lan Feiying looked at Yayu below the stage with a smile. Although there was no disgust on her face, her impression of Yayu was much worse. As an auctioneer, the most annoying thing is people who interrupt the rhythm of bidding. At first, she had a good impression of Yayu. Although he was not handsome, he was at least good looking and had good talent. But who would have thought that Yayu would be so petty and had no understanding of her feelings on the stage? If the rhythm was interrupted by someone in the middle of the normal time, it would be fine, but today her sister was still watching in the private room, and she wanted to show her best side to Lan Murian. When she thought of this, Lan Feiying inadvertently raised her eyes and glanced at the private room on the second floor. In front of a private room, the thin curtain was gently lifted, and a woman wearing light white cloud-embroidered shoes walked out of the private room. She glanced around and her sight quickly fixed in front of a private room. She walked towards it with lotus steps. Strange, is there something wrong with my sister? Lan Feiying's eyes flickered slightly, and she was a little doubtful. Originally, because Musian gave her Liu Guangtu 2 days ago, Lan Murian did not plan to attend this auction again, but in order to see her sister's grace, she finally came. Lan Feiying shook her head gently, dispelling those thoughts in her mind, looking at the monks under the stage, and spoke again, attracting everyone's attention to this auction. Musian was sitting in the private room at this time, holding a teacup in one hand, and holding Yechian's delicate jade hand with the other hand under the table, playing with it absent-mindedly. On the surface, he was as steady as an old dog, but in his heart he was panicking. Yayu was too uncultured. He couldn't win the line, so he just reported the point to shake people. Musian thought in his heart. Since awakening his memory, most things have been under the control of Musian, whether it is diverting the attention of the Gongsun family and the Dan Chamber of Commerce or encircling the black-robed people, or even obtaining the energy of the heavenly way. The only accident was the appearance of the sky-devouring Python Queen, but the difference in strength between the two sides was so great that there was no room for maneuver. Only this time, he deeply realized that things were deviating from the established track he had originally arranged. Yayu's words just now were simply to mock Musian for spending more than 2,000 spirit stones to buy a useless waste. But in fact, Ya Lingxian will still return the 2,000 spirit stones to Musian at that time. Musian can even use Ya Lingxuan's return of 2,000 spirit stones to make another move, inviting her to a nearby attic for a cup of tea and a chat, and brush up the girl's favor. In other words, Yayu has always been on the first floor, while Musian is on the 5th floor. However, if the off-field factors are taken into account, Yayu's attack will directly penetrate from the 1st floor to the 5th floor. Musian held the teacup, took a sip of tea, and thought about life. What's wrong with you? In the private room, Yechian seemed to notice Musian's abnormality and looked at him with concern. Yelingxian also looked over, frowned slightly, and whispered, "If you are not feeling well, don't force yourself. We will take you back." If it were normal, Musian would have been happy to hear that the sisters were going to take him back. After all, this meant that his strategy plan was one step closer. But now, Musian shook his head and smiled, "I'm fine, just thinking about something." "But your palms seem to be sweating. Are you really okay?" Yechian asked in a low voice. Musian's palm hidden under the table was holding one of her hands, so Yechian could naturally feel his temperature changes. Musian waved his hand and said, "It's really okay, don't worry." Just as he finished speaking, he suddenly heard a sound of footsteps approaching slowly not far away. The auction under the stage was still going on. Musian listened to the approaching footsteps, and his other hand clenched slightly, pressed against his mouth, and imitated the sound of a rough man, coughing hard a few times. Ahem, ahem, ahem. I wanted to hint to the girl outside that the private room she was looking for was not here, but these coughs directly coughed by Ruoxi, who was at the door, in. She lifted the curtain, and a beautiful face appeared in the sight of the three people. Wearing a white low-cut long skirt and a pretty face, Bai Ruoxi, who was already weak in temperament, looked even more pitiful. For any man, Bai Ruoxi is the kind of beauty who can arouse men's desire to protect her and make people want to hold her in their arms and love her well. But in front of Musian, Bai Ruoxi, who lifted the curtain and appeared in front of the private room at this moment, seemed like the fuse of explosives. Bai Ruoxi's usual cold and weak look was gone. She looked at Musian expressionlessly, and then examined the Yes sisters. Yelingxian and Yechian also examined this famous beauty in Tianxian City. "Sister Bai, what's the matter with you?" Yelingxian raised her head and asked with a faint smile. Bai Ruoxi glanced at Musian with a faint gaze, and then cast her eyes on Yelingxian, who was wearing a purple dress, and smiled softly, "I'm here to find someone." "Who?" Yelingxian glanced at Musian casually and asked, "Could it be Mr. Mu?" She continued to smile, "I remember Mr. Mu pursued my sister for a while before, but was rejected every time. But I heard that you were intimate near the martial arts arena 2 days ago, and it seems that you are already together. Is this true?" Bai Ruoxi did not answer, and her eyes swept around the two girls in the private room. The first person she saw was the elegant and polite Miss Ye. She was smiling, wearing a purple skirt, a ribbon outlining her slender waist, and a small section of snow-white calves under the skirt, with a quiet temperament. Bai Ruoxi's eyes swept over Yelingxian and looked at her sister Yechian beside her. The pure and lovely Yechian had already broken free from Musian's palm, and now she lowered her head slightly. Noticing the gazes of the two, she smiled, opened her mouth slightly, and was about to speak. At this time, Musian poured a cup of tea for Bai Ruoxi, trying to interrupt the rhythm, and said, "Ruoxi, why did you come to the auction house so early this morning? Is there anything you want to buy? Anyway, sit down and have a cup of tea first." As he said, he looked up at Bai Ruoxi and smiled gently. Bai Ruoxi glanced at Musian quietly, and then glanced at the Yes sisters inadvertently. She sat down at Musian's invitation, but surprisingly did not ask Musian why he accompanied other girls to the auction. She just leaned forward slightly, picked up the teacup and took a sip of tea. This action made her chest, which was proud of her peers, pressed on the table, completely crushing the two beautiful girls beside her. The atmosphere seemed a little awkward. But this awkward atmosphere made Musian feel a little relieved. He was not afraid of the awkward atmosphere, but he was afraid of Bai Ruoxi's strong and aggressive questioning. Just now, Bai Ruoxi was obviously planning to say something dangerous, but fortunately he was interrupted halfway. Bai Ruoxi's personality was as he guessed, weak and passive. Unlike other people, she only felt sorry for her own son Mu. Yu's operation seemed to be in the atmosphere, but in fact, it was still within the scope of operation. At this time, I need to control the situation and ease the atmosphere. Musian smiled and was about to speak. At this time, the curtain swayed gently, and someone outside gently lifted the curtain. What came into view was a beautiful woman in a moon-white long dress. Her hair was simply tied up with a white ribbon, her black hair fell down like a waterfall, and a layer of gauze covered her pretty face. She glanced at the people in the private room casually, and then she looked at Musian coldly, with teasing and anger in her eyes. "Senior Sister Lan." The smile on Musian's face completely froze, and her body was slightly stiff, as if she was a sculpture that would be blown away by the wind at any time. Lingxian and Yeqian also looked at this woman in surprise. They knew each other's identity, but they never thought that this examiner of the sect assessment would appear at this auction, and even come to this private room. Did he go to the wrong private room, or was he looking for someone like Bairuoxi? The Yes sisters looked at Musian silently at the same time. Senior Sister Ian's relationship with Mu Lang is not that simple. Bairuoxi raised her eyes slightly, and her originally clear and beautiful eyes lost some of their luster. Musian faced these gazes, calmly put down the teacup in his hand, and smiled calmly without any flaws on his face, saying, "Senior Sister, why are you here? Aren't you not interested in the auction?" Lan Murian looked around at the people in the private room, and a light arc appeared at the corner of her mouth under the gauze, and said, "I came to the auction house to find someone, but I didn't expect such a coincidence that I ran into you here. 2 days ago, you said that you might not be able to go to the Dawn auction house with me today. At first, I thought you had something important to do. It turns out that you have already made an appointment with other people." When he said this, the cold eyes looked at him coldly. "He also said something similar to me 2 days ago." Bairuoxi sighed softly, not to mention the men, even the girls present couldn't help but feel moved when they saw this scene. She looked at Musian and asked softly, "Mu Lang, why don't you say anything?" The room was so quiet that there was no sound. A simple name made the whole room dead silent. Musian had never thought that the name he used to tease Bairuoxi before was called out by this beauty at this moment. When women of this era call their loved ones, they always add the word Lang after the surname. This name not only shows the position lightly, but also will not annoy the man, because this name was called by Musian herself before. Although she looks weak on weekdays, Bairuoxi's operation is much higher than that of several people. Yeqian had just experienced the feeling of love. When she heard Bairuoxi's name, her face suddenly dimmed and she lowered her head and didn't speak. When she was in a bad mood, she would not show it directly, but would just bear it silently. Lingxuan's face was also cold, and she looked at Bairuoxi silently. She could feel that Bairuoxi's address was a bit like a declaration of sovereignty. Musian's heartwarming action just now made the girl feel a little good. Even though Lingxian didn't have any feelings for Musian, she felt a little dissatisfied when she heard Bairuoxi's statement that was similar to a declaration of war. Lan Murian was covered with a veil, and no expression could be seen, but her eyes became colder and colder. Musian often exchanged letters with Lan Murian in the past few days. Every now and then, Musian would express her longing for him. She had some good feelings for this boy who was a little younger than her. At this moment, she heard Bairuoxi's address, and naturally felt subtle. Yu stood outside the private room, standing still. He wanted to mock Musian again before leaving, but he never expected to hear the conversation coming from the private room. For a moment, he didn't know whether to gloat or envy. After a long pause, Yeqian raised her slightly red eyes and asked, "Miss Bai, are you kidding?" In the past, Bairuoxi hated Musian very much. When she and her sister were on the street, she would occasionally see Musian following Bairuoxi like a fly, but Bairuoxi never paid attention. But now, This beauty actually called him Mulang? Biruoxi shook her head gently, raised her head and looked at Musian, and said softly, I won't make such a joke. I have brought Mulang to meet my parents before, and... Her face turned red and continued, we have practiced dual cultivation. The atmosphere in the field was completely frozen, even Lan Mulian's face was not right. Yayu, who was standing outside, was completely frozen, and his heart was greatly shocked, and he staggered back. It has only been a short time since he started pursuing Biruoxi, but their relationship has already reached that level. And why is that examiner also related to Musian? Isn't she an inner disciple of Lianji sect? If Yayu was still gloating over the Shura field that Musian was facing just now, then now there is only jealousy in his heart that is hard to extinguish. But fortunately, through this opportunity, Ye Qian and Ye Lingxian should also realize what kind of scumbag Musian is. This is the only little comfort Yayu can give himself besides jealousy. At this time, Yayu felt a kind of anger and jealousy in his heart that a goddess was pushed by a scumbag, but he was powerless. In the private room, Musian looked at the dead silence of the private room, his scalp tingling, but he never spoke. He couldn't speak now, nor could he make any explanation. Because Musian is the center of the contradiction, deep in the vortex, no matter what he said, it would be wrong. Speaking carelessly would only make himself the target of everyone's fire. But it is not that there is no way out of the situation. Although this wave has greatly reduced his image, Musian has had a vague premonition of the scene in his heart for a long time. People who often walk by the river will get their shoes wet, even him. He is definitely a little panicked, but he is not panicking to the point of being desperate or even self-destructive. Musian knows very well what kind of personality Biruoxi has. He also knows the personalities of other girls. To put it bluntly, this crisis seems thrilling, but there is actually a way out. After all, Musian has long been known as a romantic person who is obsessed with beauty and goes to the Jiao Fangxi all year round. In fact, these girls are aware of this matter in their hearts, but when they get along with Musian, his words and deeds make the girls selectively ignore Musian's past image. This time, coming to the auction house with the Yes sisters, and even the exposure of his dual cultivation with Biruoxi, just made them recall another romantic impression of Musian in the past. He can't speak now, but there are people who can speak.